The frost came early that winter, settling over London like a thin sheet of glass. Shop windows glimmered, lamplighters hurried through the mist, and carol singers wrapped their scarves tighter as they rehearsed in the alleys off Bishopsgate. Christmas should have been everywhere, bright, clattering, cheerful. And yet, behind half-closed shutters, something else drifted through the season. The sharp, sweet sting of ether. It clung to parlours, to doctors' bags, to fashionable drawing rooms where the scent of oranges and pine should have been. In more than one household, the holiday tree stood undecorated, abandoned, because its mistress was upstairs breathing from a bottle that erased both hunger and grief. Doctors warned that it soothed the nerves. Chemists sold it in blue-labelled vials, promising a modern miracle for winter melancholy. But Londoners knew better. They whispered of sons who wandered the streets in a daze, of mothers found sleeping through Christmas dinner, of church choirs missing half their singers. Ether slipped into the holiday like a silent intruder, turning merriment thin and brittle. By mid-December, parish notices quietly begged families to keep the substance away from the young, and several districts, desperate, embarrassed, took the unthinkable step. Christmas gatherings were to be limited, if not outright stopped, until the epidemic calmed. This is the story of the winter London tried to save its people by silencing its own holiday. Subscribe and stay with me, there are more fog-lit truths to uncover, and I want to know, where are you listening from tonight? The frost arrived earlier than anyone expected, brushing the rooftops with a thin silver glaze that caught the lamplight and made London look momentarily innocent. It was the kind of cold that stiffened lace curtains and crept beneath door frames like an uninvited guest. Most winters inspired a mild bustle, neighbours clearing steps, children tracing patterns on frozen panes, but that year the season carried a strange stillness, almost as if the city itself were holding its breath. By dawn on the first Monday of December, pavements glittered with ice, and the usual clamour of coal wagons and costermongers was softened to a hush. Something was amiss. You could feel it the moment you stepped outside. Mrs. Penbury, who prided herself on being the earliest riser on Bishopsgate, noticed the first oddity. As she polished her front window, she spotted her neighbour, a smartly dressed clerk named Mr. Dandridge, standing motionless in his doorway with his coat only half on, staring blankly at the street as though he'd forgotten where he was meant to go. The frost at his boots sparkled innocently, but his eyes did not. When she called out to him, he blinked, startled, muttered a few incoherent syllables, and retreated indoors. The door shut with unusual haste. She told herself it was the cold. She told herself perhaps he'd had a late night. But as she swept her steps, she realized the footprints around his doorway were scattered, as though he'd been walking in erratic circles long before she'd noticed him. 2 houses down, a Christmas wreath hung crookedly, its ribbon frozen stiff. It hadn't been touched since it was hung, which in itself was strange. The Thompsons were known for fussing over every detail of holiday decor. They usually spent the first week of Advent retying bows, rearranging boughs of holly, scolding children for jostling the ornaments. This year, though, their curtains remained drawn even as the maids of the street began shaking out carpets. Neighbours whispered that the Thompsons had not attended church the previous day, that their daughter's piano lesson had been cancelled without explanation, that a delivery boy had knocked 3 times and received no answer, though he swore he heard movement inside. By the time the sun climbed above the sooty roofs, the frost had hardened into a glittering crust that magnified what many households tried quietly to hide. There were bottles, small, blue-labelled, and unmistakable, sitting on windowsills where no one had meant to leave them. One such bottle, half full, lay tipped in the snow by a garden gate, as if dropped in haste. Carriage drivers noticed people moving strangely, hesitating at corners, stumbling over nothing, walking with slow, drifting steps, as though the cold were smothering their senses instead of sharpening them. At the market stalls, vendors exchanged uneasy glances. Trade was sluggish, and customers lingered with vacant expressions, their pupils too wide for morning light. The frost did not cause this, of course. It merely revealed it. London had spent months ignoring the sweetness that curled through its drawing rooms and bedrooms, the sharp vapor that clung to shawls and handkerchiefs. Ether had been a quiet indulgence at first, something to steady the nerves, to soothe sleepless nights, to help one float through the unpleasantness of modern life. Chemists sold it readily, physicians recommended it freely, and fashionable households embraced it with a kind of delicate pride. But the frost, indifferent and unforgiving, exposed the consequences in the stark clarity of winter light. As the day wore on, more signs emerged. A maid was seen shaking her mistress awake 3 times before giving up and pulling the curtains shut again. A shopkeeper found one of his assistants dozing upright behind the counter, an empty vial hidden beneath a ledger. And farther down the street, in a modest house with ivy clinging to its brickwork, a mother sat slumped in her armchair, while her children, pale with hunger, pressed their hands against the cold glass to watch the snow. Their Christmas decorations were still boxed in the corner, untouched. By evening, the frost had become a mirror reflecting not purity, but neglect. It clung to windows of houses where no candle had been lit, no fire tended. It glazed over thresholds where holiday wreaths lay untouched. It whispered into every passerby's ear the same quiet truth. London was slipping, not into winter, but into something far more troubling. And though no one said it aloud, many began to fear that this Christmas would not resemble any they had known before. The first carol of the season was meant to rise like warm breath into the cold December air, a gentle promise that Christmas remained untouched, unchanged, unbroken. Yet when the choir gathered in the vestry of St. Hildegard's that Thursday evening, the usual flutter of anticipation was missing. Voices that once filled the chamber with bright chatter now trembled with hesitation, as though each singer feared to hear their own sound. The frost outside pressed against the stained glass, turning candlelight into trembling shards across the wooden floor. It made the room shimmer beautifully, but there was no beauty in the faces of the boys who had come to rehearse. The choirmaster, Mr. Haddon, arrived last. He stepped through the door with the slow, careful movements of a man measuring every breath. His coat was dusted with frost, though the walk from his lodging to the church was hardly long enough for that. He carried his music folio under one arm, but it sagged strangely in his grasp, as though his fingers lacked the strength to hold it upright. A hush fell over the boys at the sight of him. They were used to his crisp commands, his sharp ear, his insistence on precision. But tonight his steps faltered. Twice he paused before reaching the conductor's stand, steadying himself with a hand on the pews. "Page 7, gentlemen," he said at last, his voice thin, the words shaped as if his mouth were numb. "The Coventry Carol, from the top." The boys raised their scores, though several exchanged worried glances. A few of the older choristers had noticed the change in him over the past fortnight, how he lingered in the vestry after rehearsal, how he pressed a handkerchief to his mouth, how he once snapped at a child with an uncharacteristic sharpness and apologized a moment later with tear-filled eyes. But it had been the faint, sweet scent clinging to his coat that confirmed their suspicions. Not cologne, not incense, ether. He lifted his hands to begin the piece. They trembled almost imperceptibly. "Lully, lulle," the boys began. The first notes drifted into the nave, thin and wavering. Their voices lacked the steady center that usually held the melody aloft. One of the younger boys stumbled over a phrase. Another drifted off-key entirely. Mr. Haddon attempted to guide them, but his gestures were sluggish, as if he were conducting through water. His eyes unfocused briefly, then blinked rapidly as he forced himself back into the moment. The second verse was worse. Halfway through it, he lowered his arms abruptly and leaned heavily against the stand. The boys fell silent at once. Only the sound of distant street traffic, muffled wheels on frost, seeped through the church walls. "I beg your pardon," he murmured, pressing his fingers to his temple. A touch of dizziness. The cold, no doubt. But the boys knew it was not the cold. The sweetness in the air betrayed him. One child, brave in the way only the young can be, stepped forward. "Sir, should we fetch someone?" Mr. Haddon shook his head sharply, too sharply. The motion made him sway. His folio slipped from his hand and fell open on the stone floor, pages fluttering like startled birds. The gasp that rose among the boys was not simply for the spectacle, but for the truth laid bare. Their beloved choirmaster, the man who had trained them to breathe as one, was unraveling before their eyes. He staggered toward the vestry door, whispering something about needing air. The children followed, unsure whether to stay or go, their small shoes tapping in frightened rhythm across the aisles. Outside, the frost seemed to glow with an unnatural brightness. Mr. Haddon braced himself against the stone archway, drawing in long, shuddering breaths that misted in the cold. "I will be quite all right," he insisted, though his voice broke on the last word. "Go home now. Quickly." They obeyed, but not without looking back. Several saw him reach into his coat pocket, saw the glint of a bottle's glass neck, saw the tremor of desperation ripple through him. That night, the choir's song never rose beyond the churchyard. Instead, the echo of what should have been the absent harmony. The lost melody drifted through the neighborhood like a broken promise. Windows remained shut, curtains stayed drawn, and London, listening in the hush that followed, understood that something precious had begun to fade. A carol sung through numb lips was no carol at all. It was a warning. The frost did not lift the next morning. If anything, it thickened, as if the night had exhaled one long, slow breath that settled over every cobblestone and gutter. Londoners woke to streets that gleamed like polished pewter, beautiful at first glance but strangely lifeless beneath the sheen. The usual winter bustle, the shouts of costermongers unloading crates of oranges, the clatter of carriage wheels over uneven stones, the cheerful calls of children racing to claim fresh snow seemed muted, as though the city were wrapped in wool. On Cheapside, the marketplace stirred reluctantly to life. Stalls rose not with the usual enthusiasm but with hands that moved mechanically, without the chatter that normally accompanied the season. Holly sprigs, meant to bring luck and cheer, hung limply from awnings. Even the red of the berries seemed dulled by the grey morning. A fishmonger spreading crushed ice across his counter paused mid-motion, staring at the street with unfocused eyes, the ladle in his hand tilting until water spilled soundlessly onto the ground. Across from him, a baker set out trays of buns, spiced, glazed, meant to entice passers-by with thoughts of Christmas mornings. Yet his movements were stiff, distracted. A small blue bottle sat near the till, half hidden behind a stack of paper bags. It should not have been there. It had no place among dough and sugar and cinnamon. And yet it remained, like an unwelcome reminder of what had become commonplace. A coach rattled weakly down the lane, its driver hunched forward, not from cold but from a weariness that seemed to radiate from his bones. His horse snorted clouds of steam, impatient, confused by the frequent halts where its master blinked slowly, fighting the heaviness behind his eyes. Twice he nearly steered into a snowbank before jerking the reins back into line. The shops along the row fared no better. Many opened late, some not at all. At Mrs. Talbot's millinery, the little bell above the door chimed with a hollow, lonely sound. Inside, hat boxes sat stacked neatly as ever, but no one tended the counter. Customers called out tentatively. No answer. In the back room, through a sliver between the curtains, one could see Mrs. Talbot herself slumped at her sewing table, her head resting on her folded arms. Threads spilled from her lap like fallen snowflakes, bobbins abandoned mid-stitch. A faint, chemical sweetness hung in the air. Next door, the candlemaker's apprentice swept the front stoop with frantic, jerky motions. His broom scraped loudly against the stone, breaking the oppressive quiet for only a moment before fading into the numbness of the street. When a gentleman asked him whether the shop would be selling its usual Christmas tapers, the boy hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the dim interior where his master sat staring blankly at a flame he had not trimmed. Anxiety spread from shop front to market stall like a chill sharper than the frost. It was subtle at first, a tremor in a hand, an unfinished sentence, an absent-minded stare, but it grew unmistakably pervasive. Even the city's smells felt wrong. Coal smoke, usually so dominant, could not smother the faint sweetness that lingered at street corners, drifting out of half-open doors, rising from basements where bottles were kept for nerves. Shoppers moved differently too. They shuffled instead of walked. Voices rarely rose above a murmur. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, sensing a strangeness they could not name. A few cried without cause, others stared at the ground as though reading secrets hidden in the frost. At midday, when the sun attempted half-heartedly to pierce the clouds, a single accordion player arrived at the market. He stationed himself near the fountain, fingers freezing on the metal buttons. Usually he played bright songs, reels, jigs, lively pieces that coaxed coins from pockets. Today he tried a carol, soft and familiar. The melody faltered after the first verse. His breath caught, his eyes glazed, the accordion sagged in his grip. Around him, no one stopped, no one smiled, no one hummed along. The streets, once the heartbeat of holiday cheer, felt hollow. As afternoon dimmed toward evening, the lamps flickered on one by one, their glow trapped in fog. Shadows pooled in doorways where men loitered with bottles tucked inside their coats. Women hurried past them with lowered heads. No laughter rose from taverns. No musicians played at corners. No children raced ahead to admire the decorated windows. The city had not yet spoken aloud what it feared, but the truth lay thick as frost beneath every hesitant step. London's joy was fading. Its streets, usually so lively at Christmas time, had forgotten how to breathe. And in the silence, the scent of ether lingered. The morning light seeped timidly through the lace curtains of the Fairchild residence, scattering pale gold across the drawing-room carpet. Outside, frost clung stubbornly to the window-panes, softening the view of neighbouring rooftops into a watercolour wash of whites and greys. Within, however, the room held a peculiar stillness, the kind that suggested not peace, but neglect. The air felt heavy, stale, as if it had not been stirred properly for days. It was a stark contrast to how this room usually appeared in December, adorned with ribbons, scented with pine, and echoing with the Fairchild daughters' laughter as they arranged ornaments and argued good-naturedly over placement. But this winter, the mantelpiece told a different story. There, among polished silver candlesticks and the family's portrait miniature, sat a small blue bottle. It did not belong. Its presence disrupted the symmetry Mrs. Fairchild so carefully maintained. The label, once crisp, had frayed at the edges, softened by handling. A delicate ring of residue clung around its mouth, glistening faintly in the morning light. Anyone else might have mistaken it for a medicinal tonic, but in fashionable homes across London, the blue label had become unmistakable. Ether. Its sweet scent mingled with the fading aroma of yesterday's fire, creating a faint but unmistakable perfume that hovered in the room like a ghost. Mr. Fairchild stepped inside just after 8, his footsteps soft on the carpet. He paused when he saw the bottle. Again, he closed his eyes briefly, as though summoning patience, then crossed the room and picked it up with careful, almost reluctant fingers. "Not again," he murmured. His voice was not angry, anger had faded weeks ago, but tired, worn thin by a helplessness he struggled to articulate. He turned the bottle in his hand, the liquid inside sloshing quietly, nearly empty. He replaced the cork with a firm push, then set it back down in the precise center of the mantelpiece, where its quiet accusation might finally be unavoidable. Behind him, Soft footsteps approached. "Is Mother awake?" asked Clara, the eldest daughter, wrapping her shawl around her thin shoulders. Her face was pale for a girl of 19. Shadows pooled beneath her eyes as though sleep had become a scarce luxury. "Not yet," Mr. Fairchild replied. "I tried." Clara's gaze drifted to the bottle. She exhaled a brittle breath. "Shall I take it away?" "No," he said. "Leave it." She looked at him, puzzled. He added quietly, "If we hide them, she only finds more." Clara nodded, though her throat tightened. She remembered the early days, how her mother had first used ether only for headaches, prescribed by their well-intentioned physician. A drop on a cloth. A momentary relief. How miraculous it had seemed. How modern, so simple compared to the harsh purgatives and foul-tasting remedies of the past. But then the headaches multiplied, or perhaps the relief simply grew too tempting to resist. Now Mrs. Fairchild spent her mornings in her room, curtains drawn, breathing deeply from the cloth kept on her bedside table. The world outside blurred, softened, quieted, and with it her responsibilities, her conversations, her very presence. Clara crossed to the hearth and warmed her hands. "She promised she would stop," she whispered, "before Advent." "Yes," her father said, "she did. Promises, like frost, melted quickly under certain conditions." From upstairs came the faint creak of floorboards. Both father and daughter turned toward the staircase, listening, a sigh, a thud, then silence. Mr. Fairchild's jaw tightened. "I'll go," he said, though his shoulders slumped as he moved toward the door. Before he disappeared, Clara called after him, "Father." He paused. She hesitated, then asked the question that had haunted her for days. "Will we still have Christmas?" The question settled heavily between them, echoing off the quiet walls. Mr. Fairchild did not answer immediately. He glanced back at the blue bottle, the intruder, the tyrant, the reason their house felt hollow. His expression softened, melted into sorrow. "I don't know," he said finally. He climbed the stairs, leaving Clara alone with the mantelpiece and its cruel adornment. She reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the bottle lightly. It was cool to the touch, deceptively harmless. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, indifferent to their worry. Outside, bells chimed faintly through the frost. Inside, in the warmest room of the house, Christmas felt impossibly far away. The Davenport residence had always been the pride of Belgrave Square during the Christmas season. Each year, without fail, Mrs. Lucinda Davenport transformed her parlour into a glittering haven of winter merriment. Friends whispered eagerly about her decor long before December arrived. The grand spruce tree trimmed with ribbons imported from Paris, hand-painted glass baubles from Bohemia, candles infused with orange peel and clove. Her gatherings were legendary. Evenings of music and laughter where guests warmed themselves beside the marble fireplace while snow drifted softly outside. But this year, the parlour was unrecognizable. It was not disorderly. The Davenport household would never fall into outright disarray, but it was unmistakably abandoned. The Christmas crates, usually emptied by Advent's first week, still sat stacked in one corner, the lids half open, bitter with dust. Silk ribbons lay unwound, their once vivid scarlets dulled by the dimness of the room. A box of ornaments had tipped, scattering delicate glass spheres across the carpet like fallen stars, yet no one had bothered to pick them up. The mantelpiece, where garlands once draped in elegant cascades, stood bare. Even the fireplace was cold. Thin daylight filtered through the heavy drapes, turning the room a muted grey. The air smelled faintly of stale perfume and something sharper, something that did not belong to Christmas at all. Ether. The scent clung to the upholstery like a memory that refused to fade. Sarah, the youngest housemaid, stepped cautiously into the parlour with her dusting cloth clenched tightly in hand. She paused at the sight. The emptiness, the stillness, the faint echo of what should have been joyous. Her breath left her in a soft shiver. "Haven't they decorated yet?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. The butler, Mr. Harrow, appeared silently behind her, his face drawn. "Mrs. Davenport is indisposed," he said quietly. This word had become the staff's refrain, spoken with a mixture of fear and apology. Sarah swallowed. "Still?" "Yes." His gaze drifted toward the staircase, as though he could see through the ceiling to the master bedroom above. "She has not come down for 3 days. But Christmas is a week away." Harrow gave no response. Sarah lowered her eyes and resumed dusting, though her cloth trembled. She remembered last year Mrs. Davenport descending the stairs in her emerald velvet gown, laughter bright as the ornaments she hung with her own hands. The house was alive then, sparkling with colour and warmth. Candles glowed in every window, and the scent of cinnamon and pine lingered long after guests had gone home. But now, the silence felt wrong, not peaceful, suffocating. As Sarah dusted one of the fallen ornaments, she caught her reflection in the cracked glass, distorted, uncertain. She set it gently in the box, but her fingers brushed something else, a soft linen cloth, folded neatly, its corners stained with a faint, unmistakable residue. She froze. The cloth smelled of ether. Before she could hide it, footsteps creaked at the doorway. Mr. Davenport himself appeared, a tall, dignified man who had aged 10 years in the past 2 months. His eyes were weary, lined with sleeplessness. "Leave it," he said softly when he saw the cloth. "Just leave it, Sarah." "Yes, sir." He walked past her and into the dimness of the parlour, his gaze falling on the unopened crates, the empty hearth, the forgotten ornaments. His shoulders sagged. He picked up a glass bauble one Mrs. Davenport loved and held it for a long moment. The light caught on the surface, casting fractured reflections across his face. "She would never have let it sit like this," he murmured. Sarah dared to speak. "Will she be well for Christmas, sir?" His hand tightened around the bauble. A long, painful silence followed. "I don't know," he said at last. He set the ornament down as carefully as if it were a fragile memory, then turned to go. Before leaving, he paused. "If she wakes," he said quietly, "tell her I've kept the tree waiting." Sarah nodded, her throat thick. When he was gone, the parlour felt emptier than before. Outside, carolers were practicing somewhere in the square, their voices faint through the frost. But their song did not penetrate the Davenport home. It lingered only at the windows, unanswered. Upstairs, behind a locked door, the mistress of the house lay drifting in a haze of sweetness and forgetfulness, while downstairs her Christmas waited silently, untouched. And the parlour, once the heart of her joy, remained a room where no tree was trimmed. On Threadneedle Street, where the gas lamps burned brighter and the pavements carried the confident click of gentlemen's boots, the Harcourt family's Christmas dinner was a cherished tradition. For decades, their home had glowed with warmth each December, the clatter of silver cutlery, the hum of polite conversation, the aroma of roasted goose drifting through hallways lined with portraits of ancestors who seemed forever watching over the festivities with dignified approval. But on the evening that should have marked the beginning of Christmas week, the Harcourt dining room sat in uncanny stillness. The table was set perfectly, as though anticipating guests who had simply stepped into another room. Crystal glasses caught the lamplight and threw fractured rainbows across the white tablecloth. The silverware gleamed. Fresh holly sprigs rested atop each folded napkin. The goose roasted to a golden crisp sat untouched at the centre, its scent mingling with cloves and sage. Steam no longer rose from its surface. The gravy boats had cooled into dull pools. The bread rolls had stiffened at the edges. It was a dinner waiting for someone who was never coming. Mr. Harcourt stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the perfectly arranged settings. His expression was unreadable, though the lines around his mouth had deepened in these past months, carved by a strain he refused to voice. He glanced toward the stairway every few moments, as though expecting his wife to drift down any second, brushing past him in her emerald gown, apologizing lightly for the delay while insisting the dinner begin at once. But the stairway remained silent. In the kitchen, Mrs. Rook, the cook, wrung her apron anxiously. She peered into the dining room, watching her employer with quiet sorrow. "It'll spoil if it sits any longer," she whispered to the maid beside her. "Everything's gone cold." The maid, Anna, tightened her grip on the serving tray. "Should we bring it back, ma'am?" Mrs. Rook's lips thinned. "Not yet. The master wants it to stay as she left it." Anna's gaze drifted toward the staircase as well. Is Mrs. Harcourt still unwell?" Unwell was the word everyone used now, a soft word for something sharp and bitter. Mrs. Rook sighed. "She hasn't left her room since morning. The daymaid says she barely spoke." "And the bottles?" Anna asked cautiously. Mrs. Rook's only answer was a small shake of her head. Upstairs, behind a closed door that had once opened frequently and easily, Mrs. Eleanor Harcourt lay half-reclined on her chaise, the curtains drawn against the world. An ornate handkerchief rested on her chest, still faintly damp with ether. Her eyes fluttered open only briefly, unfocused, drifting across the room without truly seeing it, or the holiday preparations she had once orchestrated with such gusto. A few hours earlier, she had promised her husband she would come to dinner. She had even rung for her maid to choose a gown. The rust-coloured silk lay draped across a chair, untouched. Back downstairs, Mr. Harcourt pulled out her chair, a futile gesture, but one he could not bring himself to abandon. The carved wooden seat scraped softly across the floor. For a moment, he let his hand rest on its back, as though feeling for the warmth she once left behind. Then he sat alone. He did not lift his fork. He did not touch the wine. His gaze rested on the goose, on the untouched holly sprigs, on the empty places set for his wife and children who had declined to join, unable to watch this ritual of grief. The clock ticked steadily, each second marking the widening distance between what had been and what now was. Outside, carriages passed, their wheels slicing through frost. A group of carolers drifted down the street, but their song faltered when they saw the unlit windows of the Harcourt home. Inside, the dining room remained suspended in the saddest kind of celebration, a perfect meal growing cold before a man who could do nothing but sit in the presence of his own helplessness. Eventually, Mr. Harcourt rose. He gathered his composure like a man putting on an overcoat. Without touching the dinner, he blew out the candles one by one, sending the room into shadow. The final flame flickered uncertainly before surrendering to the dark. In the quiet that followed, the cold dinner stood as a quiet testament not to neglect but to mourning. And Threadneedle Street, usually so dazzling in December, felt dimmer that night, as though the frost itself had absorbed the sorrow seeping from the Harcourt home. The Turner household on Baker Street had once been a place where laughter lived easily. 3 children filled its narrow hallways with constant motion, footsteps racing up staircases, whispered conspiracies, the thud of pillows, and the soft rustle of mischief. Their mother, Mrs. Turner, had been the kind of woman who filled a home with warmth simply by being in it. She baked sugared biscuits on cold mornings, read stories by the fire in the evenings, and made a ritual of trimming the Christmas tree with the children each December, letting them place each ornament with ceremonious pride. But that winter, the house had fallen under a hush so profound that even the floorboards seemed reluctant to creak. 7-year-old Nora sat in the living room with her little brother Thomas, both perched on the edge of the hearthrug. The fire crackled quietly, its light casting orange patches across their faces. They should have been stringing popcorn for the tree, or arguing about which toy soldier belonged on the mantel. Instead, they sat with hands folded in their laps, listening not for carolers or sleigh bells, but for any sound from upstairs. Their mother had not come down since morning. Thomas hugged his knees. "Will Mama read to us tonight?" he whispered, barely audible. Nora shook her head slowly. "Not tonight." "How do you know?" She hesitated. Because the housemaid had carried up another cloth. Because Papa had spoken in a low, strained voice with the doctor. Because the sweet, sharp smell drifted down the staircase like an invisible fog. But she couldn't say those things. "She's just very tired," Nora murmured. Thomas nodded, though he didn't understand. Children always know when they're being shielded, but they don't always know which truth is being kept from them. At the far end of the room, their eldest brother, Henry, sat at the window, tracing circles in the frost with a finger. He was 12, old enough to understand too much, and young enough to feel powerless. When he heard their father's footsteps approaching in the hallway, he quickly wiped the frost trail away and folded his hands neatly on his lap. Mr. Turner entered the room, his features tight with worry. He attempted a smile, thin, tremulous, as he knelt beside his children. "Your mother is resting," he said gently. "She needs quiet." They nodded in unison. They had grown used to the need for quiet. The house, once filled with sound, now felt shaped by silence. It had become a law unspoken, but deeply understood. Henry cleared his throat. "Should we start decorating without her?" She said. "We could this year." Mr. Turner looked at the unlit tree in the corner of the room. It stood tall and bare, its branches waiting, its pine scent mingling faintly with the odor that drifted from upstairs. Beside it lay the open boxes of ornaments, tiny silver bells, childhood keepsakes, bright baubles wrapped in tissue. They had been waiting since the first week of Advent, but Mr. Turner couldn't bring himself to say yes. "No," he replied softly. "We'll wait for her." Henry lowered his eyes. Thomas leaned against his sister. Nora stared at the staircase, imagining her mother lying very still in her bed, breathing slowly through a cloth. The stillness grew heavier. A knock at the door startled them all. The housemaid hurried to answer, returning a moment later with a wrapped parcel, a gift from their grandmother. The children's eyes lit briefly with hope. "Shall we open it, Papa?" Thomas asked. Mr. Turner forced another smile. "Not tonight. Tomorrow." Everything was postponed now. Everything waited on their mother's waking and on her clarity when she did wake. After the children were sent upstairs, Nora lingered at the landing. She listened, small fingers curled against the banister. She heard her father's footsteps below, then the muffled sound of him sinking into a chair, then a faint, weary sigh. But she heard nothing from her mother's room. Not a single movement. The silence pressed against her chest with the weight of a secret she was too young to name. She tiptoed into the bedroom she shared with Thomas and closed the door with painstaking care. As she slipped under the covers, she whispered to her brother, "Tomorrow we must be very quiet again." And in rooms all across London, other children whispered the same. Christmas was coming, but joy had learned to hold its breath. And the children, too quickly, too obediently, had learned to keep quiet. The bells of St. Hildegarde's had always rung with particular brightness on the Sunday before Christmas. Their chime, warm, resonant, confident, drifted across the rooftops of Limehouse and gathered families from every corner of the parish. Mothers wrapped shawls around their shoulders, fathers buttoned their coats with practiced precision, and children clutched candles that flickered merrily in the dark. By tradition, the midnight service was the heartbeat of the season, the night when hymns shimmered beneath the vaulted ceilings and the city's worries were, if only for an hour, held at bay. But this year, when the bells began their slow toll at 11:30, the sound echoed strangely through empty streets. Fog clung low to the ground, softening the edges of the stone steps and swallowing the lamplight whole. The church door stood open, as it always had during Christmastide, welcoming any weary soul seeking refuge. Yet no one approached. The walkway, usually lined with eager parishioners, lay untouched, the frost undisturbed by even a single footprint. Inside, Reverend Ashcombe stood at the pulpit, his fingers wrapped tightly around its edges. The candles flickered across his face, revealing deep shadows beneath his eyes. He looked out over the rows of empty pews, silent, expectant, devoid of human warmth. His voice, when he finally spoke, trembled, though 2 or 3 are gathered. He paused. But there were not 2. There was only 1. Behind him, the choir stalls remained dark. The boys who should have been there, their faces bright with nervous anticipation, were home now, their parents hesitant to let them out after nightfall. Even the organist had failed to arrive. She had written earlier that evening, apologizing for her absence, explaining that her husband had taken ill suddenly. The letter smelled faintly of something chemical and sweet. Reverend Ashcombe swallowed hard and stepped down from the pulpit. His shoes echoed sharply against the marble floor, the sound far too loud in the cavernous silence. He approached the first row of pews and placed a hymn book gently upon the seat, almost as if he were setting out a place for someone who might yet arrive. But no footsteps followed. In the far corner of the church, Mrs. Reed, the caretaker, moved with slow, deliberate steps as she lit the last of the candles along the aisle. Each flame flickered valiantly, though they revealed more emptiness than light. She met the Reverend's eyes briefly and offered a small, sorrowful shake of her head. "They're frightened," she whispered. "Or ashamed." He nodded. He'd seen it in their faces over the past weeks, the reluctance, the evasions, the quiet desperation. Families stopped attending services one at a time. First the Thompsons, then the Pembrokes, then the Alders. Some claimed illness, some claimed exhaustion. Others simply didn't answer when he knocked at their doors. But he knew. They all knew. Ether had threaded itself through households like a silent intruder, claiming the vulnerable, weakening the strong. And now, even the church, the last shelter against the city's troubles, felt its influence. Reverend Ashcombe returned to the pulpit and opened the Book of Common Prayer. His hands shook slightly as he began the reading, his voice echoing off stone and wood, rising into arches that had once held centuries of devotion. "A light shineth in darkness." His voice faltered. The darkness felt heavier this year. Outside, the bells finished their tolling. Their final chime lingered in the night, almost mournful. Still, no parishioners came. Not a single candle approached from the street. Not a single hymn rose to meet the rafters. The Reverend closed the book. The church felt unbearably large around him. Silence pooled in every corner, like cold water. Mrs. Reed extinguished the candles one by one. Each flame surrendered softly, sending curls of smoke into the air. When she reached the final candle, she hesitated, as if extinguishing it would confirm something irreversible. But rituals must be completed. She pinched the wick, and darkness fell. Reverend Ashcombe walked slowly to the door and looked out into the empty street. Snow began to fall, delicate, unassuming, blanketing the steps in white. For the first time in his tenure, the midnight service had been held without its congregation. He whispered a prayer into the stillness, not for salvation, but for strength. Strength for the families who hid their shame behind shuttered windows. Strength for the children who learned to tread softly. Strength for the city that had forgotten its own traditions under the haze of a blue-labeled bottle. As he closed the church doors, the wind carried away the last faint traces of incense, leaving behind the cold, the fog, and the aching absence of voices that should have filled the night. The little shop on Fleet Lane was never meant to draw attention. Wedged between a tobacconist and a tailor, its narrow windows and modest sign had blended into the neighborhood for decades. People passed it daily without remark, a reliable, unremarkable chemist's establishment where one might purchase liniments, powders, or a soothing tonic for winter coughs. But that December, the chemist's door developed a strange new reputation. It never seemed to close. From morning until well past dusk, the The bell above it jingled with relentless, troubling regularity. Sometimes it rang softly, as though a nervous hand pushed the door with hesitation. Other times it chimed sharply, betraying urgency. The neighbors noticed. They whispered about it. They wondered what remedy could possibly warrant such constant demand. Inside, Mr. Claiborne, the chemist, moved with a mechanical precision that bordered on trance. His spectacles slid down the bridge of his nose as he reached for bottles and tins, measuring powders by habit, not attention. The shelves behind him, once neatly arranged with apothecary jars in pale greens and amber browns, had begun to show gaps, some appearing faster than he could refill them. But the most noticeable change was the row of blue-labeled bottles lined at eye level. Ether. They vanished each day, though Mr. Claiborne restocked them diligently, even desperately. His hands trembled when he wrote out the receipts. His eyes avoided the faces of the customers who reached for the bottles with furtive glances and coin purses clenched far too tightly. On one particularly frigid morning, Mrs. Whitcomb shuffled in, her shawl clutched beneath her chin. She was normally a proud woman, her steps brisk, her chin high. But now she kept her gaze on the floor as she approached the counter. "Another? For the nerves," she murmured. Her voice cracked on the last word. Mr. Claiborne did not ask questions. He had stopped asking 2 weeks prior, when the line first began to form outside. He simply took a bottle from the shelf, wrapped it in brown paper, and slid it across the counter. Their fingers brushed. Hers were cold and trembling. His were warm but unsteady. She left without another word. Moments later, the bell chimed again. A dock worker entered, shoulders broad, jacket dusted with frost. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes red-rimmed. "Same as before," he muttered, tapping 2 coins on the counter. Mr. Claiborne hesitated, just briefly. Then he handed over another bottle. The dock worker departed, and the bell chimed once more. It became a rhythm, a haunting cadence that filled the shop, the street, the chemist's very bones. People from all walks of life passed through that door. A seamstress with a strained whisper, a maid with hurried footsteps, a gentleman in a fine coat who refused to meet anyone's eye, a young clerk who feared the trembling in his hand would reveal more than he could bear. By evening, the shop grew colder. The small stove in the corner sputtered as if exhausted by the day's confessions. Mr. Claiborne sank into his chair behind the counter, rubbing his temples. The faint scent of ether lingered in the air, sharp, sweet, unmistakable. It clung to his clothes, seeped into the wooden shelves, and hung in heavy clouds above the shop floor. He had once been proud of his work, once believed he brought comfort and health to the community. But now, as he stared at the depleted shelves, a quiet dread nipped at the edge of his thoughts. His door remained open, but the city around him was closing in. Late that night, as he turned the sign to "closed" for the first time that day, he paused. A final knock sounded soft, hesitant, desperate. Through the frosted glass, a silhouette trembled. Even without seeing the face, Mr. Claiborne knew what they sought. He opened the door. The figure stepped inside, clutching a handkerchief, eyes pleading. "Please, just one more." Mr. Claiborne looked at the blue bottles, looked at the shaking hands, looked at the shadows beneath the stranger's eyes. For a moment he considered refusing. For a moment he imagined a city where he closed the door, where the bell fell silent, where people found strength elsewhere. But the moment passed. He wrapped the bottle gently and handed it over. As the figure slipped into the cold night, Mr. Claiborne locked the door at last. He leaned his forehead against the glass, breath fogging the pain. Outside, the frost glimmered indifferently under the lamplight, as if reflecting his shame back at him. On Fleet Lane, the chemist's door finally closed. But the damage it had allowed through it lingered everywhere. The frost was already thick on the iron railings outside St. Bartholomew's parochial hall, When the first whisper crossed the threshold, a whisper so soft it could have been mistaken for the hiss of the gas lamps, yet those who heard it felt an instinctive tightening in their chests, as though some silent boundary had been crossed. It was a word none dared to say aloud only weeks before. Barn. It surfaced in the murmurs of parish elders as they gathered inside the long, draughty hall that December evening. The building, usually reserved for charity meetings and choir receptions, held an unfamiliar tension. The air was heavy with a mixture of damp wool coats, burnt lamp oil, and the faint, unpleasant sweetness of ether that had begun to cling to nearly everyone, whether they used it or not. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a curious onlooker. Reverend Markham was the first to speak. Standing at the head of the long oak table, he removed his gloves with stiff, deliberate movements. His face, normally rosy and animated during the Christmas season, was drawn and pale. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," he began, his voice steady but strained. "I fear we have reached a point where discussion is no longer avoidable." Around him, the council shifted uneasily in their seats. The matronly Mrs. Whitcomb dabbed her nose with a lace handkerchief, though she did not raise her eyes. Mr. Breland, the town solicitor, kept adjusting his spectacles in a nervous rhythm. Even the constable, a broad man with the countenance of someone not easily rattled, tapped his boot against the floor with barely concealed agitation. Reverend Markham opened a ledger. "The incidents this week alone, they cannot be ignored." He read aloud. 3 mothers found unconscious during daylight hours, ether cloths near at hand. A young clerk collapsing at the post office. A fire sparked in a boarding house by an overturned lamp near a drying rag steeped in ether. Attendance at school diminished by half. The midnight service abandoned altogether. Each entry seemed to weigh the room down further. By the time he closed the ledger, the silence was brittle. Mrs. Pembury, who had remained quiet until now, cleared her throat. "My granddaughter will not come downstairs," she said in a trembling voice. "She sleeps, or she dreams, or she wanders. I found her with a bottle this morning." A few nodded sympathetically, though others looked away, perhaps thinking of their own unspoken burdens. The constable folded his arms. "If this continues, we will have deaths, many more than we've already had." A hush fell. The word deaths seemed to shatter something invisible. It was Mr. Breland who finally approached the unthinkable. "We must consider suspending the Christmas festivities." The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Whitcomb gasped. "Suspend Christmas? But it has never been done." "Nor have we ever seen a winter like this," the solicitor replied. The Reverend closed his eyes briefly, as if receiving a blow. "The children will suffer. Families will suffer." "Families are suffering already," Mr. Breland said grimly. "Ether has stolen more from this parish in 4 weeks than any thief could manage in a year." A murmur of agreement spread, slow and reluctant. Mrs. Pembury's voice broke. "If people gather as they do every Christmas Eve, the feasts, the fairs, the church aisles full, do you not think some will bring bottles with them, or collapse, or worse?" No one answered. They didn't need to. The truth had finally arrived in their midst, fully formed and undeniable. For a long moment, the hall was so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock seemed deafening. Finally, the Reverend spoke, his tone softer than before. "If we do this, it must be handled delicately. The city is already trembling. A proclamation of this sort could divide us. Better a division," the constable muttered, "than a funeral." A few council members exchanged nods. One by one, hands rose, some firm, some trembling, until a majority stood in quiet, somber agreement. The decision had been made. A letter would be drafted, notices printed. The news spread through the parish with careful, cautious wording. "Due to the dangers presently facing our community, Christmas gatherings are to be limited until further notice. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the frosted windows, as though the city itself had overheard and shuddered. When the meeting concluded, the council members stepped into the freezing night. Their breath rose in thin plumes, dissolving into the fog. Not one of them looked up at the faint lanterns or the distant glow of shop windows, preparing for a holiday now shadowed by dread. The whisper had become a verdict. And although the word ban was never printed, never spoken aloud in formal decree, it passed from house to house in the days that followed, hushed, fearful, inevitable. London was beginning to understand that this Christmas would not be celebrated. It would be survived. By the second week of December, the fog no longer drifted through the streets in thin veils. It clung instead dense, unmoving, with the stubborn weight of something that had settled in for a long stay. Lanterns glowed as blurred halos. Carriages appeared and vanished like half-remembered dreams. Footsteps echoed strangely, as if the city were listening more intently than usual. It was into this muted world that the notices arrived. They appeared before dawn, pinned to lampposts, tacked to parish doors, and pasted onto brick walls still slick with frost. Their pale paper curled slightly at the corners, and their ink, hurried, uneven, seemed to tremble with the urgency of their message. Important public notice for the safety of the parish. The heading alone was enough to stop early risers in their tracks. Mr. Ayers, the milkman, paused mid-delivery when he spotted the first copy near the corner of Bishopsgate. His breath plumed in the cold as he leaned in to read the small print. The bottles on his cart clinked behind him, impatient for the day's route. But he did not move. His brow furrowed as he took in the words. "Good heavens," he murmured. Moments later, across the street, Mrs. Linton tugged her shawl closer and read another, posted on the apothecary window. Her grip tightened around her basket. She looked around as though the fog itself might react. And in front of St. Hildegard's, a group of schoolchildren clustered around the notice fastened to the church door, their cheeks rosy, their eyes wide. The older ones read the text aloud in whispering voices. Due to increasing incidents affecting the health and welfare of the community, it is advised that all seasonal festivities, including gatherings, markets, carol services, and socials, be postponed until circumstances improve. The children stared at one another. "Postponed?" a girl in a red knitted hat asked. "That means no Christmas market," another murmured. "No carols," added a third. A younger boy tugged on his sister's sleeve. "But we were gonna sing," he protested, his lip trembling. His sister placed a hand on his shoulder. "Hush," she said gently. "It's only for a little while." But no one believed it. As the morning unfolded, the fog grew thicker, or perhaps the city's mood simply made it feel so. Doors opened, people stepped out, wrapped tightly in coats and worry. And everywhere, the notices greeted them like silent heralds. At the butcher's, Mr. Barlow shook his head. "A ban without calling it a ban," he said grimly. At the bakery, Mrs. Dalrymple wiped flour from her hands and whispered, "If they're telling us this much, imagine what they aren't saying." Children were ushered indoors. Clerks lingered uneasily outside office buildings, staring at the posters as though searching them for loopholes. Even the constables on their rounds carried an unusual heaviness in their posture. Ether had already robbed London of its music, its gatherings, its ease. Now, it seemed, it had taken its holiday as well. By midday, the fog and the notices were indistinguishable from one another, white shapes drifting through the city, carrying the same unwelcome truth. Conversations grew hushed, as though the very words of the announcement could spread infection. When Reverend Markham stepped out of the parochial hall and saw the poster nailed to the church door, he closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling the cold, damp air. "God help us," he whispered. Then, gathering resolve, he went inside to prepare a sermon that would explain the unexplainable. In more prosperous neighborhoods, the reaction was quieter but no less troubled. Housemaids fetched morning deliveries and paused to read the notices posted on garden gates. Footmen returned from errands with somber expressions. Behind fine brass knockers and polished windows, families stood in parlors and drawing rooms, reading the same words again and again. However delicately phrased, the message was unmistakable. Christmas must wait. By late afternoon, a new layer of frost formed over some of the notices, sealing them in an icy glaze. The words beneath remained legible, but they looked ghostly now suspended in a crystal tomb. As evening approached, lanterns burned more brightly to pierce the fog, but even their glow felt strangely subdued. The city did not ring with anticipation or bustle. Instead, it held a quiet ache, a collective pause. And somewhere in the shifting grey of the fog, a bitter truth whispered from street to street. It was not the cold that had dimmed Christmas this year. It was the ether. By the time the notices had settled into the fabric of the city, pinned, pasted, whispered, feared the soundscape of London had changed. Winter often brought a softness to the streets, a muffling of noise under frost and fog, but never silence, never this. Carols had always been the city's pulse in December. Children practiced them on stoops, their breath puffing in time with the melody. Shopkeepers played them from small, crank-operated music boxes. Carolers gathered under lampposts, warming their hands between verses, as neighbors dropped coins into rattling tins. Even the factories, grim and relentless the rest of the year, allowed the melodies to spill through their yard gates during the holiday season. But now, carols had been stilled. It happened gradually at first. A hesitant pause here, a missed rehearsal there, a single family declining to join the neighborhood choir, a schoolmistress cancelling after 3 of her pupils fainted in the same week. But after the notices were posted, the stillness grew deliberate, a cold, sweeping hush that settled over every street like a second frost. On Grafton Row, the children of the parish school normally rehearsed each morning in the courtyard, their lilting voices echoing between the brick walls. This year, the courtyard stood empty. Snow lay unmarked by bootprints. The music stands remained stacked in the corner, each dusted with a fine glitter of frost. Miss Hulworth, their teacher, watched from her classroom window, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had tried once to gather the children. She had raised her baton, but they had looked at her with wide, fearful eyes glancing toward the street, toward the homes where ether bottles hid behind curtains, and she had lowered it again. In another part of the city, the once renowned Limehouse Carol Guild met in a narrow hallway behind the cobblestoned White Swan Inn. There, the choirmaster, Mr. Pendle, opened his book of hymns and stared at the pages as if they belonged to some language he no longer recognized. His basses and altos stood dutifully behind him, but their breaths came uneven, and their expressions carried the heavy guilt of those who had seen too much suffering to sing of joy. "We cannot do it," Mrs. Channing whispered, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. "Not this year." Mr. Pendle closed the book gently. No one protested. But the absence was felt most acutely in the streets themselves. On corners where groups once gathered to sing hymns of hope into the firelit windows of strangers, there now stood only fog. The lanterns glowed faintly, illuminating empty cobbles and swirling white breath from passing horses. Without the familiar melodies, the city felt as though it had forgotten how to move. Its energy hung suspended, as if waiting for a cue that never came. A solitary boy on Dorset Street tried once, just once, to begin a carol on his own. He stood by the lamppost, clutching a battered hymn book and singing the first lines of "Once in Royal David's City." His small voice rose, uncertain but brave, into the frosted air. But halfway through the second verse, a figure appeared at an upstairs window. A woman, pale, shawled, and trembling, pressed her hand to the glass, mouthing words the boy could not hear. Then she collapsed out of sight. The boy closed his book. He did not sing again. Even the great organ of St. Hildegard's, whose majestic thunder could normally be heard rolling through the parish on winter nights, remained silent. Mr. Halberd, the organist, visited once after the notices were posted. He placed his hands on the keys, feeling the familiar smoothness beneath his fingertips. But the thought of drawing families to the church, of filling the aisles with people who might faint or falter, made him withdraw. He rested his forehead against the wooden frame of the instrument, the grief settling over him like dust. Outside, the frost thickened, the fog deepened, and London became a city without its song. Households felt the loss in ways they could not articulate. Children hummed quietly under their breath, unsure if they were allowed even that. Mothers paused while stirring their pots, the instinct to sing a lullaby to their infants, replaced by a tightening of the throat. Fathers lit candles with a heaviness in their hands, remembering the warm harmonies of Christmases past. Somewhere in all of this, hope dimmed, not extinguished, but flickering, fragile. For the first time in living memory, London reached December without the comfort of voices rising in unison. A winter without carols was more than a quiet season. It was a season without breath, a season without heart. And, as the streets absorbed the silence, the city braced itself for the darkness yet to come. Constable Edwin Harrow had patrolled Bishopsgate for nearly 12 winters, and in all that time he had never known the season to be anything but lively. December usually brought out the city's best behavior: shopkeepers sweeping snow from their stoops, street vendors calling cheerfully through the cold, children dragging holly boughs behind them like trailing banners. Even the mischief of the season, pickpockets, drunken revelers, late-night lovers darting into alleyways, carried a certain warmth. But not this winter. This winter, Bishopsgate felt sick. Constable Harrow stood beneath a gas lamp whose flame flickered uncertainly in the fog. His breath rose in ghostly bursts as he scanned the street. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. Houses that once glowed with candlelight were dark behind heavy curtains. A chilling quiet blanketed the row, broken only by the occasional distant cough or the faint clink of glass from a window left ajar. He tightened his scarf and began his rounds. At the corner of Malden Court, he spotted his first worry of the evening. A man slumped against the brick wall of a closed shop, his gloves discarded in the snow. His coat was unbuttoned despite the bitter cold, and his head lolled to one side in a manner Constable Harrow had seen too frequently these past weeks. "Sir?" Harrow approached cautiously. "Are you ill?" The man muttered something indistinct. His eyes fluttered open, clouded and unfocused. A cloth lay near his hand, thin, creased, faintly damp. Harrow recognized the scent immediately. A sweet, chemical whisper. Ether. He swallowed the frustration rising in his throat. "Come now," he said softly, helping the man to his feet. "Let's get you home." But the man stumbled, a limp weight. Harrow dragged him to a nearby doorway, where a light flickered inside. He knocked firmly. After a long pause, a woman cracked the door open, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Oh, thank heavens," she whispered when she saw the man. "I'd been searching for him." Her voice carried a fragile mixture of relief and resignation. She took her husband's arm and guided him inside. Harrow closed the door gently behind them, but not before catching sight of a bottle on the mantel, its blue label stark against the dim interior. He stepped back into the fog, his jaw clenched. This made the third such incident tonight, and it was not yet midnight. Further down the street, lantern lights spilled from the window of Mr. Tolland's bakery, once a bustling hub filled with laughter and warm bread. Harrow peered inside. Mr. Tolland sat slumped at a table, staring blankly at a cup of tea he'd never raised to his lips. Beside him, a young apprentice pressed a cold cloth to his master's forehead. The constable entered quietly. "Evening," he murmured. The boy looked up, eyes wide and frightened. "He's been like this since morning, sir." Mr. Tolland said nothing. He merely blinked slowly, his fingers twitching faintly. Harrow exhaled through his teeth. "Keep the fire lit. I'll send for help." He stepped back outside, his heart heavy. How many more? How many were hidden behind curtains, behind locked doors, behind the quiet of their own shame? His lantern beam cut across the pavement as he rounded the next corner and stopped. A group of figures huddled in the alley behind the tobacconist. 3 young men, barely more than boys, passed a bottle between them. Their movements were slack, unsteady. When the constable approached, they stiffened not in the guilty startle of lawbreakers, but in the panicked recoil of cornered animals. "Evening, lads," Harrow said carefully. "Let's see what you've got there." One boy laughed, high and thin. "It helps, sir," he said, lifting the bottle with trembling fingers. "Just helps us through the cold." "That's not helping you," Harrow said quietly. "It's hollowing you out." He confiscated the bottle, though he knew they'd find another within the hour, and sent them stumbling home with stern instructions to rest. As they vanished into the fog, he leaned against the wall, rubbing his temples. Bishopsgate was unravelling. The constable continued his rounds, but each step felt heavier. From open windows drifted the same sweet scent. From shadowed corners came the same uneasy silence. And from behind closed doors, muffled sobs or restless shuffling hinted at households in quiet crisis. Near the end of his patrol, Harrow paused beneath a frost-laden lamppost. He looked down the length of Bishopsgate, once vibrant, now dim, as though the street itself were sinking into a troubled sleep. He whispered into the cold, "Where will it end?" The lamplight flickered, as if unable to answer. And somewhere deep in the fog, a church bell chimed, not with joy, not with welcome, but with warning. London was losing itself, and Constable Harrow, lantern in hand, could only watch the darkness spread. For months, the people of Spitalfields had clung to a single bright promise amidst the gloom: the Christmas fair. It was to be the one cheerful respite in a season grown grey and sickly. Every December, the fair transformed the square into a glittering tableau, lanterns strung overhead, stalls packed with sugared almonds and roasted chestnuts, buskers singing old songs, and children shrieking with laughter as they darted between vendors. The fair was a yearly miracle, a place where London's chill softened beneath the glow of merriment. But this year, the fairground stood hollow. The morning it was meant to open, a thin layer of frost blanketed the square like pale lace. The wooden stalls, usually vibrant with ribbons and wreaths, sat empty, their tabletops bare, their canopies trembling softly in the wind. The great fir tree at the centre, erected with hopeful ceremony just a week prior, drooped beneath the frost, its branches heavy with unlit lanterns that swung gently, chiming like ghosts of the festivities that should have been. No music drifted through the air. No vendors warmed their hands over braziers. No children tugged impatiently at their parents' sleeves. The square felt abandoned, as if the city had collectively turned its gaze away. Only one man stood in the quiet expanse, Mr. Barrow, the fair's organizer for nearly 20 years. His boots made lonely prints in the frost as he paced slowly between the empty rows of stalls, his breath rising in faint clouds. He clutched a clipboard, though no lists remained to check. His red scarf, usually bright and festive, hung limp against his coat. "They should be here by now," he muttered, glancing at the clock tower. "Chestnut sellers, toy merchants, musicians." His voice trailed off. He knew they wouldn't come. Behind him, Mrs. Pratt, the gingerbread baker, approached hesitantly. Her sleeves were rolled up, dusted faintly with flour, though she carried no trays of gingerbread in her hands, a strange sight for anyone who knew her. Her eyes were swollen from lack of sleep. "Mr. Barrow?" she said softly. He turned. Their eyes met his, full of disbelief, hers full of sorrow. "I can't do it," she whispered. "My husband, He slept through the night again. I tried to wake him, but she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The meaning hung clearly in the cold air. Mr. Barrow swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he said. Truly. More vendors emerged from the fog, one by one, not with merchandise, but with apologies, excuses, bowed heads. The lantern maker, whose wife hadn't eaten in days. The toy carver whose father fell unconscious at the workbench. The seamstress whose son had wandered into the street in an ether daze. Each story, whispered quietly, carried the same bitter thread. "How can we sell cheer," one man murmured, "when none remains in our homes?" The group gathered near the fir tree. Frost had turned its needles a dull silver. Mrs. Pratt reached up and brushed one lantern with her fingertips. It swung lightly, chiming with a brittle note. "This was supposed to be the children's night," she said. Mr. Barrow nodded, staring down at his boots. "The city isn't well enough for a fair." The words seemed to settle over them all, heavy as snowfall. By midday, curious residents peeked from their doorways. A few children ran to the fairground, mittens on their hands, hope in their eyes, but their excitement faded quickly as they saw the empty stalls. One little girl, her hair tied with a fraying ribbon, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, where are the sweets?" Her mother forced a smile. "Not today, darling." A boy kicked the frozen ground. "But it's Christmas," he said with a cracked voice. Mr. Barrow stood motionless as parents carried their disappointed children home. He watched until the square emptied again, the fog swallowing their silhouettes. Finally, he removed his hat, pressing it to his chest. With slow, deliberate movements, he climbed the steps to the fir tree. He reached up, untied one of the lanterns, and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of its silence. Then, with a breath that trembled, he extinguished the small flame inside. One by one, the others followed suit, silently removing lanterns, tying down canopies, gathering a fair that had never truly begun. By evening, the square stood bare again. No music, no sweets, no laughter. Only the frost remained and the memory of what should have been. The Christmas fair had not simply been cancelled, it had been mourned, and the city, already weakened by its quiet plague, felt its absence like the extinguishing of a final, fragile light. In the narrow terraces of Whitechapel, where life pressed close against brick and soot, midwives had always been the surest guardians of the neighbourhood. Their footsteps were familiar on every doorstep, quick, competent, steady as clockwork. They arrived with warm blankets, steaming kettles, and voices that soothed even the most frightened, expectant mother. December, though bitter, was usually hopeful for them. It was a month of newborn cries, lantern-lit vigils, and the soft rustle of swaddling cloth. But this winter, something darker threaded itself through their rounds. Mrs. Emmeline Hart, the most seasoned midwife in the district, felt it first. It was just after dawn when she stepped into a small, cramped tenement off Kent Street, summoned to attend to a young mother in labour. The stairs creaked beneath her boots as she climbed, lantern in hand. When she reached the top landing, she paused, struck by an unexpected, sharp, sweet odour. Ether. It clung to the hallway like an invisible fog, not the faint medicinal trace she was accustomed to finding in hospitals, but something heavier, something unregulated, unrestrained. She pushed open the door. Inside, the room was dim despite the morning. Curtains were drawn. A fire burned low. The young mother, pale and trembling, lay upon the bed with sweat beading her forehead. But it was the father who caught Mrs. Hart's attention, slumped in a chair beside the hearth, head tilted, a cloth still pressed loosely in his open hand. "Dear Lord," she whispered. The mother tried to lift her head. "Don't mind him," she gasped between contractions. He says it helps him think, helps him breathe." Mrs. Hart knelt beside the bed. "It will not help you," she murmured. "And God knows it doesn't help him." She cast a stern look toward the father, though she doubted he could see her through the haze clouding his gaze. "He'll be of no use tonight, I fear." The mother gave a weak, humorless laugh. "He hasn't been for weeks." As the labor intensified, Mrs. Hart worked with quiet efficiency, but the room felt wrong. The air was thick, oppressive. Twice she had to open a window to let the chemical scent escape, and each time the freezing wind cut through the room like a knife, making the mother shiver violently beneath her blankets. Midway through the delivery, Mrs. Hart heard the floorboards creak. Another midwife, young Lydia Crowe, entered with a pail of steaming water. She stopped short, her nose wrinkling. "It's strong in here," Lydia whispered. Mrs. Hart nodded grimly. "Too strong." A cry came at last, thin but alive. Mrs. Hart wrapped the newborn in warm cloth and placed him gently into his mother's trembling arms. But even in this moment of joy, the sweet, choking scent lingered, wrapping around them like a sinister veil. When the father finally stirred, blinking stupidly at the scene before him, Mrs. Hart confronted him. "You ought to throw that bottle out," she said firmly. "Your wife needs you present, not drifting in clouds." He looked at her with glazed confusion, then at the child in his wife's arms. Something like shame flickered briefly in his eyes, quickly extinguished. Mrs. Hart sighed. She had seen this before, and she would see it again. As she and Lydia stepped back into the street, fresh frost crunched beneath their boots. The sun remained hidden, turning the morning into a dull wash of grey. "That's the third home this week," Lydia murmured, hugging herself against the cold. "3 fathers lost to the bottle, 3 mothers left to carry it alone." "4," Mrs. Hart corrected quietly. "And I fear it will be more." They walked in silence toward their next call. Behind them, a window burst open as the father attempted to clear the chemical smell from the room too late. Much too late. Ether had already seeped into the walls, the blankets, the very breath of the home. All down the street, other families stirred, other windows opened briefly, releasing faint traces of the same sickly sweetness. "It's everywhere now," Lydia whispered. "I smell it on my clothes when I finish my rounds. I smell it when I sleep." Mrs. Hart nodded. "A plague," she said softly, "but one we carry into our own homes." As the 2 midwives disappeared around the corner, a thin wail of a newborn rose behind them, not triumphant, not joyful, but fragile. It cut through the cold morning like a plea. London listened. But London, sick and silenced, could not yet answer. Dr. Alistair Montford had always been a cautious man, cautious with his diagnoses, cautious with his prescriptions, cautious with his words. In a city where panic could spread faster than disease, a steady physician's voice was more valuable than any tonic on his shelves. For nearly 20 years he had tended to the families of Clerkenwell, treating winter fevers, setting broken bones, assisting mothers in confinement, and soothing the worries of those who needed reassurance as much as medicine. But this winter had changed him. It began with small signs, missed appointments, trembling hands hidden behind sleeves, the faint chemical scent clinging to clothing that should have smelled of lavender or starch. Patients who once greeted him with warmth now stared through him with hollow eyes. Mothers postponed bringing in their children. Fathers collapsed at their workbenches. Entire households sank into a dull stupor. And everywhere he went, the sweet, unmistakable scent of ether followed. He had tried, at first, to ignore it, to trust his colleagues, to hope the city would correct itself. But each week brought more troubling scenes. Entire families drifting in and out of consciousness. Children left to care for parents. Bottles tucked into drawers, cupboards, coat pockets, their blue labels multiplying like a rash no one wished to acknowledge. The breaking point came one grim afternoon when he visited the home of the Abernathy family. The housemaid had fetched him in tears. "It's the master, sir," she sobbed. "He won't wake." And the missus, she could not finish. Dr. Montfort hurried through the frost, boots crunching on broken ice. When he entered the Abernathy's drawing room, he found the patriarch sprawled on the chaise, chest rising shallowly. The curtains had been drawn tight. A fire smouldered low. Ether hung in the air so thickly that Dr. Montfort's eyes watered. Beside the hearth, Mrs. Abernathy knelt, her hands clasped, murmuring fragments of apologies and prayers. She was barely coherent. A half-empty bottle lay beside her. The doctor's nostrils burned as he crossed the room. "Open the windows," he commanded the maid, who obeyed at once. Cold air rushed in, sweeping the odour aside. After tending to Mr. Abernathy, whose pulse fluttered like a dying moth, Dr. Montfort turned to the mistress of the house. "Madam," he said softly, "you must tell me how long this has been going on." Her eyes darted toward the bottle. Her lips trembled. We only meant to ease the nerves. Everyone uses it," the chemist said. "I know what the chemist said," Dr. Montfort interrupted, though his voice remained gentle. "But this is not easing nerves. This is poisoning your lives." She burst into tears. He guided her to a chair, wrapping her trembling hands in his. "You must stop," he said. "Both of you. At once." He left the house shaken. That night, unable to sleep, he sat at his writing desk. The fog pressed against the window panes, and the city felt unnaturally still. He dipped his pen into ink and began to write a letter, not to a patient, not to a colleague, but to the district council. The letter was long, more forceful than anything he had ever written. It described families slipping into addiction, children neglected, lives endangered. It detailed the long hours he had spent reviving those lost to stupor, the heartbreak of watching mothers gasp for air, fathers stumbling through their days like shadows. He ended with a line he never imagined himself writing. "If measures are not taken immediately, our city will sink under the weight of this quiet plague." The next morning, after a sleepless night, he delivered the letter to the council chambers himself. His hands shook as he passed it to an attendant. He felt as though he were placing a confession upon the gallows. By evening, the letter had circulated through the district. By the next day, it was whispered through every street. And by the end of the week, Dr. Montfort, a man who had spent years avoiding attention, found himself the reluctant voice of a crisis no one dared publicly acknowledge until now. Mothers stopped him in the street to thank him. Fathers removed their hats. Midwives nodded gravely when he passed. But not all reactions were kind. Some accused him of exaggeration. Others muttered that he sought notoriety. A few families, still deep in Ether's thrall, barred their doors when he approached. Dr. Montfort bore it all in silence. For the doctor who finally spoke did not seek glory. He sought a cure for a city losing itself. And London, trembling beneath frost and fog, began at last to listen. The Harrington Winter Banquet had long been one of London's quiet marvels, not flashy, nor ostentatious, but elegant in the way only well-bred restraint could achieve. Each December, the double doors of their Queen Anne townhouse opened to a small circle of esteemed guests, merchants, scholars, clergymen, and the occasional visiting barrister. Candlelight shimmered on polished silver, violins murmured softly from the corner, and Mrs. Harrington's famed plum pudding soaked in brandy and studded with sugared peel was unveiled with great ceremony. But on the night that should have marked their annual celebration, the Harrington dining room bore witness to an altogether different spectacle. It began beautifully, as it always had. The long mahogany table gleamed under clusters of beeswax candles, their golden light casting warm halos upon faces powdered for the occasion. Crystal glasses sparkled. A garland of ivy twined down the center of the table, its dark leaves glistening with dew from the morning's frost. The footman moved silently, ladling soup into porcelain bowls. Guests murmured greetings, their breath warming the winter air with anticipation. Mr. Harrington, tall and dignified, stood at the head of the table and tapped his spoon lightly against his glass. "A toast," he announced. To health, to home, and to the year ahead. Chairs shifted, hands reached for glasses, and then a sound not befitting celebration. A soft, wet thud. Mrs. Harrington, who had risen with her husband to deliver her customary welcome, swayed. Her fingers loosened around her glass. Before anyone could react, she collapsed onto the rug, her skirts billowing around her like a marooned cloud. The room froze. "Eleanor?" Mr. Harrington dropped to his knees beside her, voice cracking with panic. The guests stared in stunned silence, some clutching their napkins, others rising halfway from their chairs, as if their bodies could not decide whether to sit or stand. Footmen rushed forward. Someone gasped. Someone else knocked over a glass. The violinist in the corner lowered his bow mid-note, letting the final chord dissolve into stillness. Mr. Harrington brushed his wife's hair from her damp forehead. Her skin was pale, her eyelids fluttering, and then that scent, sweet, sharp, inescapable. A blue-labeled bottle slipped from the folds of her shawl and rolled across the floor with a soft clink. The guests recoiled as though it were a living thing. Mrs. Whitcomb, seated nearest, covered her mouth in horror. "Oh, my heavens!" Miss Linton whispered. "Not her. Surely not her." The footmen lifted Mrs. Harrington gently and carried her toward the sofa by the hearth. Mr. Harrington followed, helplessly wringing his hands. He had suspected, of course, he had the changes in her sleep, the strange dazes, the sudden spells of trembling. But suspicion was one thing. Evidence laid bare before one's closest friends was another. Guests rose from their seats, exchanging looks heavy with dread and sympathy. They moved quietly toward the vestibule, their departure a wordless choreography of social grace and grief. Plates of untouched soup steamed faintly on the table, their aromas fading into the cold stretches of the dining room. Mrs. Linton leaned toward Mr. Harrington on her way out. "Please, call a doctor." "I will," he whispered, voice breaking. The front door shut behind each departing guest with muffled finality until only the Harringtons remained. As the carriage wheels faded into the winter night, Mr. Harrington returned to the sofa, where his wife lay breathing shallowly. Her fingers twitched, her lips moved in faint murmurs only he could hear. He lowered himself beside her, the weight of the moment collapsing the last remnants of dignity he had tried to maintain. The decorated room, once warm, now dim, felt unbearably large around them. The abandoned banquet table loomed in the next room, candles flickering sadly over a feast meant for laughter and conversation. The toast, interrupted, hung unspoken in the air like a ghost. He took her hand gently. "My dear Eleanor, what has happened to us?" Her breath fluttered in response, but no answer came. Outside, the frost grew thicker on the window panes, the garland on the table began to wilt, and in the quiet Harrington home, where Christmas had once been celebrated with grace and splendor, the night settled heavily cold, still, and utterly heartbroken. The banquet was not merely interrupted, it had been surrendered, and London, in its fog-choked sorrow, surrendered a little more with it. The bell of St. Hildegard's had always been a herald of comfort. Its tone, deep, warm, resolute, had marked weddings, baptisms, funerals, feast days, and every ordinary morning in between. Children grew up beneath its sound. Merchants set their hours by it. Weary labourers took solace when its toll drifted across the rooftops at dusk. But on the morning the winter deepened, the bell rang at an unfamiliar hour, and with an unfamiliar purpose. It rang in warning. Fog smothered the streets so completely that the bell seemed to toll inside the mist rather than above it. Its voice shuddered through the cold air, vibrating against shutters, trembling in window glass, slipping beneath half-open doors. People paused, confused. The bell was not scheduled to ring. There was no festival, no ceremony. Mrs. Pellington, tightening her scarf as she swept her stoop, startled so sharply she dropped her broom. "What on earth is the meaning of that?" she whispered. Her neighbour, Mr. Dray, poked his head from his doorway, his brows knitted. A fire, perhaps? No, she murmured, shaking her head. No smell of smoke, but she did smell something. Faint, sweet, unmistakable. The ether scent drifted from a nearby house, a house that had been oddly quiet for days. Inside St. Hildegard's itself, Reverend Ashcombe pulled the bell rope again, his hands trembling as he guided its heavy arc. Once, twice, thrice. A rhythm meant not for celebration, but for summoning. The great bell swung overhead, groaning with age, its iron voice echoing through the cavernous stone. Behind him, Mrs. Reed, the caretaker, wrung her hands. "Are you certain, Reverend? People will worry." "They must worry," he replied, not unkindly. "They must understand." He gestured toward the small table by the altar, the one where the offering plates rested. 3 blue-labeled bottles sat there now, placed side by side like grim relics. All had been found on church property in the past week. One left behind in the pews, one dropped in the confession alcove, one discovered outside the vestry door, half buried in snow. "They are bringing it even here," Reverend Ashcombe said softly. Mrs. Reed shivered. "I never thought I'd see the day." Nor had he. He had served his parish for nearly 30 years, through cholera, through poverty, through fires and famine and political unrest. But nothing unsettled him as deeply as the quiet, creeping surrender he now saw in his flock, the slow dimming of eyes, the absence of familiar faces, the growing emptiness of the pews. He let the rope fall from his hand. The bell's final toll faded into the fog, swallowed by the heavy morning. Soon the first parishioners arrived. Mr. Kelworthy, the tailor, his shoulders stooped beneath a too-thin overcoat. Mrs. Bramwell, clutching her prayer book as though it were the last stable object in her life. A few children, walking solemnly, each holding the hand of a sibling or friend. They entered the church quietly, glancing toward the bell tower, then toward the bottles on the altar. Whispered questions rippled through the air. The Reverend lifted his hands. "My friends," he began, voice low but steady. I rang the bell to speak plainly. Ether has reached into every corner of our parish, into homes, into schools, into this very sanctuary. Murmurs rose. Reverend Ashcombe continued, "I have prayed for clarity, and today I must tell you the truth. If we do not turn from this substance, we will lose more than our celebrations. We will lose each other." A woman in the back pew, Mrs. Hollins, whose husband had collapsed 2 nights before, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. "It numbs the body," the Reverend said. "It dims the mind. But worse, it silences the soul." Silence followed his words, thick as the fog outside. Finally he stepped aside. "If you wish to pray, pray. If you wish to speak, speak. But let this morning be the moment we no longer pretend." For a long while, no one moved. Then, slowly, Mrs. Bramwell stepped forward. With trembling hands, she took a small bottle from her pocket, one she had hidden for days, and placed it beside the others on the altar. Another woman followed. Then a man. Then a teenager. The clinks of glass on wood became a soft, sorrowful litany. By the end of the hour, the altar held 13 bottles, 13 confessions, 13 surrenders, 13 unspoken pleas for help. When the congregation finally dispersed into the fog, their breath mingling in pale clouds, they carried with them not relief, not yet, but recognition. The bell had rung to warn them, and London, though shaken, had heard. City Hall, with its proud columns and echoing marble corridors, had always carried an air of certainty. Even in winter, when frost crept along its steps and fog muffled the clatter of carriage wheels outside, the building seemed immune to the tremors that afflicted the rest of London. Its lamps burned evenly. Its clocks chimed with confidence. Its council chambers vast, oak-panelled, smelling of ink and old decisions, were sanctuaries of order. But on this December morning, order felt like a fragile luxury. By the time the council gathered, the fog had thickened into a pale, swallowing shroud outside the windows. Their breath rose faintly in the cold air as they settled into their seats. Coats remained buttoned, gloves remained on hands. Even the fire at the far end of the chamber seemed hesitant to burn. A low murmur drifted through the room. Papers rustled nervously. Voices were restrained, as though each councillor feared that a raised tone might shatter the brittle calm. At the head of the table sat Alderman Pierce, his silver-rimmed spectacles glinting beneath the gaslights. He cleared his throat, and the room quieted at once. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are convened today to address the matter that has gripped our city, a matter growing more grave with each passing week." No one needed clarification. The word ether hovered unspoken over every face. Pierce continued, "Reports indicate that addiction is no longer confined to a handful of households. It has spread to every district. Bishopsgate, Clerkenwell, Whitechapel, Limehouse, Spitalfields, the West End, even Kensington." A ripple of discomfort passed around the table. Councillor Marsden, a thin man with sharp cheekbones, leaned forward. "We have issued notices, advised caution, closed certain gatherings." His tone faltered a little. "And yet, the situation worsens." "Weakness of character," muttered Councillor Pickworth. "Londoners are too easily tempted." Several heads snapped in his direction. Councillor Edith Langford, dignified, stern, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, spoke first. "Weakness? Is that how you explain mothers collapsing beside their children? Or choir boys trembling in their classrooms? Or parishioners fainting in pews? No, Mr. Pickworth, this is not weakness. This is a crisis." Pickworth flushed. "I did not imply." "You implied enough," she said. Alderman Pierce lifted a hand. "Let us remain civil." Outside, the faint toll of St. Hildegard's bell reached the chamber, a single note, long and low, carrying more sorrow than sound. Several councillors exchanged uneasy glances. Councillor Whitfield, a portly man known for his indulgent nature, spoke next. "We must consider the economic repercussions. Closing the markets, the fairs, the gatherings, it damages livelihoods. And opening them will cost lives." Langford countered sharply. A murmur of agreement rose. Pierce removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "We received a letter yesterday from Dr. Alistair Montford." At the mention of the name, the room stiffened. "He claims," Pierce continued, "that ether use has reached proportions comparable to epidemic, that families are unraveling, that infants are being neglected, that our social fabric is at risk." Pickworth scoffed under his breath, earning him a withering glare from Langford. Whitfield sighed heavily. "Surely he exaggerates." Pierce slid a document across the table. "Read it." One by one, councillors bent over the letter. Their expressions shifted, skepticism fading into unease, unease into alarm. "He says," Langford read aloud quietly, "that if we allow the holiday gatherings to proceed, we risk mass intoxication, fires, tramplings, children lost in the chaos." Pierce nodded. "He urges decisive action, extreme action." The room fell silent. Then Marsden whispered the word. None dared speak. A ban? Not a single councillor looked directly at him, but their silence was answer enough. Pickworth sputtered, "You cannot mean to abolish Christmas." "Not abolish," Pierce corrected gently. "Postpone, limit, temper our celebrations until the danger has passed." "And if the danger never passes?" Langford asked softly. A hush fell deep, oppressive. Through the frosted windows, the city stretched in muted grey. No carols, no markets, no children playing in the squares, only the fog and the faint, sickening sweetness that clung to its edges. Pierce stood. We will vote. But before we do, I ask you to consider the cost of inaction." He gestured toward the window. "London is dimming. If we allow the revelry to proceed unchecked, we may wake on Christmas morning to tragedies we could have prevented." One by one, hands rose. Some reluctantly, some trembling, some with quiet, resolute sorrow. When the final vote was tallied, Alderman Pierce closed the ledger slowly. "It is decided," he said, not with triumph, not with authority, but with grief. Outside, the bell of St. Hildegard's tolled once more, faint, muffled, mournful. Inside City Hall, every councillor understood. London had not simply voted to halt its festivities. It had acknowledged that Christmas, the city's brightest season, had been eclipsed by the shadow of a blue-labelled bottle. And no one knew when the light would return. By the close of that grey December week, London itself seemed to hold its breath. The frost lay thick on cobblestones and rooftops, a glittering testament to a winter too sharp, too heavy, and too unkind. The fog rolled between houses like a slow tide, curling into every alley and doorway, pressing against windows and doors with the weight of warning. Even the familiar clatter of carts delivering provisions was subdued, as if the city had learned to tread softly, conscious of the fragility of its people. And yet, for all its caution, London had not yet fully grasped the decree that had passed through its council chambers in hushed urgency. Christmas gatherings were to be limited. The words had been circulated with care. Notices posted at church doors, on parish halls, in markets, and pasted to the walls of chemists, taverns, and boarding houses alike. Every syllable carried the gravity of warning, though it lacked the flourish of ceremonial authority. Citizens whispered them to one another in the street, holding gloves to their mouths to muffle the tremor in their voices. They repeated the sentence over breakfast tables, in drawing rooms, in kitchens, where steam rose from kettles in slow, heavy clouds. "Limited," Mrs. Whitcomb murmured to her husband as they examined the notice pinned to their gate. "Do they mean to stop carols? To forbid markets? To—" her voice faltered. She swallowed. "To forbid the children their toys?" Her husband, normally a man of measured reasoning, did not answer immediately. He stared past the notice at the frost-bound street, the windows shuttered, the smoke rising faintly from chimneys, but failing to warm the air with its usual promise. The truth was plain to him. Nothing in the city, neither candles nor music, nor the cheerful crowding of the square, could withstand the weight of the ether now threading through homes like a silent, insidious fog. Across the city, in the narrow terraces of Whitechapel and Clerkenwell, families prepared for what they understood to be an altered season. Children were kept indoors, their excited whispers replaced by hushed attempts at play. The fires were lit, but the stockings remained empty. The trees, when they were trimmed at all, were sparse and cautious, adorned only with ornaments already in the home, lest a trip to the market invite temptation. In some households, the blue-labelled bottles were hidden in locked drawers. In others, they sat openly, their presence too normalized to be questioned aloud. At St. Hildegard's, Reverend Ashcombe read the council's decree aloud during a hastily arranged mid-morning service. His voice trembled as it echoed off the stone walls, each word a tremor in the otherwise quiet nave. Parishioners leaned forward in their pews, hearing the truth they had long suspected but had not yet faced. The familiar warmth of tradition had been replaced by an icy necessity. A city required restraint, or it would be undone. Even the children, who had once dashed through the streets in bright coats and mittens, clutched hands tightly with their elders, understanding without full comprehension that their carols, their games, and their laughter must now be measured. No longer would the square host throngs of vendors, the markets overflow with treats, or the streets resound with the mingled joy of neighbours. London had chosen caution over cheer. In private homes, whispers of resignation replaced the hum of anticipation. Mothers, already frail from sleepless nights, soothed their children with stories that lacked the usual sparkle. Fathers closed doors and windows with slow deliberation, as if protecting their families from something far more dangerous than the cold. And in every room, the faint, persistent scent of ether lingered, a reminder that the city's vigilance was born of necessity, not desire. By evening, the fog seemed heavier, carrying the weight of the decree through the lanes and alleys. The gas lamps glimmered faintly, their light swallowed by the mist, reflecting the collective caution of a city poised between survival and tradition. Families retreated indoors, markets stayed shuttered, choirs remained silent. London's Christmas would not be abolished, nor would it be celebrated in the way its citizens had known. It would exist in fragments, in hushed prayers, in private hearths, in fleeting acts of care and devotion. The city had accepted the limitation, though not without sorrow. And as the last light of day faded behind the fog-laden rooftops, a quiet thought hung over the streets like a shiver. This was a season not of joy, but of survival, and for London, it was the first time in memory that they would measure Christmas not by its warmth, but by its restraint. The snow had arrived in earnest the night before, not the delicate dusting that so often adorned London for a few hours, but a relentless, unyielding fall that blanketed rooftops and streets in white. In most homes, it was a thing of beauty, powdering the windowsills, softening the edges of chimney pots, muffling the usual clamour of the city. But in the Sinclair household, on a narrow street of Whitechapel, the snow had found its way indoors, carried on the draughts that slipped beneath ill-fitting doors and through fractured window panes. Mr. Sinclair had risen before dawn, his boots crunching over ice that had formed where last night's snow met the cold hearth. The room smelled faintly of soot and something sharper, an undercurrent that caused his nostrils to twitch. His wife, Edith, had not yet stirred, though he knew her too well. The smell clinging to the air, the cold draught twisting through the room, and the faint disturbance of her bedclothes told him she had been up at some ungodly hour, though whether in consciousness or in some fogged stupor, he could not be certain. The snow drifted against the sash windows in odd little mounds, gathering in the corners as though it had purpose. Each flake that fell into the room seemed deliberate, leaving a chill wherever it touched. A gust rattled the door, and Mr. Sinclair caught the edge of a scarf that had slipped to the floor. He set it carefully on the mantel, glancing at the collection of small, blue-labelled bottles lined like sentinels on the shelf. Ether, he sighed. The word had become both a whisper and a scream in his life. The bottles gleamed faintly in the grey dawn, indifferent to the weight of the city outside, indifferent to the weight of the lives they were quietly unravelling. Edith finally stirred. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though the simple act of sitting up required her full attention. She drew the blankets closer around her, inhaling the cool air as if savouring its bite. Mr. Sinclair approached cautiously, his hands outstretched. "Edith," he said softly, "it's nearly morning. You should come to the table." Her eyes opened, clouded and wide. She lifted a hand weakly, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Not yet," she whispered. Her voice carried a strange sweetness, sharp and unnatural. "I need a moment." He knew the moment she sought was not the dawn or the breakfast he had prepared, but the contents of the bottle that lay within reach. He stepped closer, noting the tremor of her hand as it hovered over it. "Edith," he said gently, "it will not ease anything. The snow is fine outside. It cannot help what this does to your mind." She shook her head faintly. "It helps me. Think." He caught her hand before it could reach the glass. "It dulls you. It dulls everything." Outside, the snow continued to fall, heavier now, drifting through gaps in the windowsill. Each flake seemed to press against the house, curling into corners, pooling quietly where the hearth had failed to contain the frost. The room grew colder, the air carrying the faint perfume of ether, like a ghost over the floorboards. The chill settled on Mr. Sinclair's shoulders as he pulled the blankets higher around Edith, shielding her, shielding himself. They were silent for several long moments, listening to the hiss of the snow as it gathered in impossible corners. He thought of the children on the street, the choir boys, the market children, the families who had begun to disappear into their own homes, leaving windows dark and streets deserted. The snow inside the house was not merely cold. It was a witness, a silent recorder of neglect, of absence, of the quiet domination of a blue-labeled bottle over the warmth of a home. Mr. Sinclair reached out again, this time with more resolve. "We will leave it," he said, meaning the bottles. "You will come down soon. We will not let this winter steal everything." Edith's eyes flickered, uncertain, but she said nothing. Outside, the street lay still beneath the relentless snow. Within the Sinclair home, frost gathered in corners, pooling silently, and the air remained heavy with the scent of sweet, sharp warning. Winter had arrived, and it had found the cracks in every household. The fog pressed low against the walls of the workhouse on St. George's Lane, curling through the iron railings like a pale, restless serpent. By morning, a thin crust of frost had formed over the steps, making the stones slippery beneath the boots of the few who approached. Usually, the early winter sunlight would glint off the high windows, giving the building an air of austere dignity. But that morning, it looked hollow, its bricks dull and cold. The heavy wooden door closed more firmly than usual. Inside, warmth waited only for those admitted. Outside, the city's youngest, its most fragile, pressed their faces to the gate. They had come from streets where doors remained locked, curtains drawn, and hearths dimmed. Children who should have been laughing, singing, or racing through the frost-laden alleys were instead shivering, their breath rising in delicate clouds, eyes wide, searching for a refuge that seemed always just beyond reach. Their coats were thin, many too large or too small, patched hastily with scraps from older siblings' worn clothing. The frost found its way beneath sleeves and collars, biting with a cruel insistence. At the gate, little Margaret fidgeted with the iron bars, pressing her knuckles until they went white. Her sister, Anne, hovered behind her, arms wrapped around a thin shawl, eyes darting nervously up the lane. "Do you think they'll let us in?" Margaret asked, voice barely more than a whisper. She swallowed and shivered. Anne shook her head. "I don't know. Mother, she hasn't left her room in days. Father, he can't. He's asleep." Her words trailed off. They were children too young to fully comprehend what had stolen their parents, what had hollowed the rooms of their homes and muted the usual Christmas cheer. Across the street, a group of boys huddled near a lamppost. They pressed their faces together, trying to share what little warmth they could. One clutched a small bundle, his sister's doll, wrapped in a discarded scarf. Another, older, held a cracked wooden hoop. They had not played with them for days. Their games had ceased. Laughter had been replaced by the unrelenting hush of fear and absence. The workhouse gatekeeper, a stooped man with spectacles fogged by his own breath, appeared at last. He unlocked the heavy iron chain with slow, deliberate movements. His expression was solemn, knowing that many of these children arrived from homes where ether had already claimed its quiet dominion, parents absent, distracted, incapacitated. He opened the gate with a cautious hand. "Come in," he said softly. Warmth inside, food, and shelter from the frost. The children's faces brightened just slightly, but not for long. Even here, within these walls, the air seemed touched by the lingering influence of what had haunted their homes. They entered silently, guided by the wardens who had grown accustomed to the weary, haunted looks of those arriving in droves. Rooms once filled with the hopeful noise of chores and lessons now carried a quiet tension. Children spoke in whispers, footsteps muted, as though noise itself might awaken something unwelcome. In one corner, A small boy traced patterns on the frosted window with his fingers, watching the street beyond. He saw no other children, no bustling adults, only the thick pall of London's fog and the faint glimmer of lamplight on the frozen cobbles. A sense of abandonment pressed on him, and he drew his coat tighter around his shoulders. Across the hall, a group of girls clustered near a fire that burned too low. They shivered and whispered about their families who would not appear this year, who had disappeared into the haze of ether and cold. They spoke of empty hearths and cold breakfasts, of Christmas trees left untrimmed, of stockings untouched. Each tale added to the collective weight of despair pressing against the walls of the workhouse. Outside, the city remained frozen in muted grey, streets empty of the usual festive bustle. The frost clung to every corner, a constant reminder of absence, neglect, and the quiet invasion of something chemical and unyielding. Within the workhouse, children huddled together for warmth, for solace, and, in their muted way, for hope. London had not yet surrendered entirely, but it had begun to learn the bitter truth. The season of joy could be stolen as easily as warmth from a room, leaving only silence, frost, and the shivering breaths of those too small to protect themselves. In the narrow, frost-bitten lanes of Whitechapel, the Whitman residence had once been warm with ordinary domestic rhythms. The hearth glowed steadily, the clock chimed punctually, and the small parlour smelled faintly of lavender and bread from the previous evening's baking. But that December morning, the house had become a place of tension and quiet despair, each shadow cast by the weak winter sunlight seeming heavier than the last. George Whitman, a man of modest stature and considerable resolve, had spent the night in restless pacing, listening to the soft, uneven breaths of his wife upstairs. He knew the signs, the tremors of her hands, the fluttering of her eyelids, the shallow inhalations that rose from a thin blue-labelled cloth. Ether. It had slipped silently into their lives, a chemical thief stealing the warmth and care from their home. He had long suspected it, but suspicion had hardened into certainty. As dawn crept through the curtains, George wrapped his coat tightly around his shoulders and climbed the stairs to her chamber. The floorboards creaked under his careful steps. In the dim morning light, Edith Whitman lay reclined on the chaise, eyes closed, her breathing shallow. The small bottle lay within reach, its blue label gleaming faintly in the grey light. "Edith," he whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. Her eyelids fluttered. She murmured something indistinct, and he could smell the sweet chemical tang clinging to her skin. "Please, not again," he said, his voice taut with exhaustion. "I cannot lose you, not like this." She stirred weakly, reaching toward the bottle. George caught her hand before she could grasp it, the glass cold under his palm. He pressed it to the mantel, well out of reach. "You do not need it," he said softly, though the words trembled with the weight of his own fear. "I will stay with you. We can face this together." Edith's lips parted, a faint, broken laugh escaping. "It helps me think," she murmured. George shook his head, a pang of grief striking him. "It dulls you. It dulls me. It dulls all that we have, the children, the house, the joy that should be ours in winter." For a long moment they were silent. Only the faint hiss of the wind through the poorly sealed windows filled the room. Outside, frost gleamed like splintered glass across rooftops and gutters. Inside, the scent of ether lingered, clinging stubbornly to every fabric and floorboard, pressing against their lungs like a subtle, relentless hand. He moved to her side, taking her hands into his. They were cold, trembling, yet he held them tightly. "I will not let this take you from me," he said. "No more bottles, no more haze. We will find the strength to fight this together." Edith's eyes, still clouded with the fog of chemical sleep, met his briefly. There was confusion there, faint awareness, and something softer recognition, perhaps, of the resolve she had once known in her husband. George remained beside her, holding her hand, as the minutes stretched into hours. He brought a small cup of warm tea and encouraged her to sip. He opened the windows slightly, letting the bitter, clean air drift in to fight the chemical sweetness. He spoke gently of the children, of the Christmas tree waiting to be trimmed, of the festive meals yet to come, not as commands, but as reminders of the life they had promised one another. Outside, the city awoke, streets pale and fog-laden. But within the Whitman home, a small battle had begun, one of vigilance, of quiet courage, and of love attempting to reclaim its place from the insidious influence that had crept silently into their lives. George knew the fight would not end with the morning. Ether had laid claim to too many homes, too many hearts. But for now, he held his wife's hand. He watched the frost glint through the window, and for the first time in many nights, he dared to hope that warmth could return if only he could shield it against the cold, the fog, and the bottle's deceitful allure. In the narrow, lamp-lit corridors of Kensington, Miss Eleanor Pritchard sat at her writing desk, quill poised but unmoving. The candles flickered as if reluctant to illuminate the scene, their light quivering across the ink-stained papers. A stack of pale envelopes lay before her, each intended for a different member of her extended family, each bearing the neat script that had once been her pride. The wax seal and delicate illustration, a snow-dusted holly bough, remained untouched, a silent witness to the impossibility of sending them. For weeks, Eleanor had planned these cards, imagining the small joy they would bring. Her brother in Hampstead receiving one on Christmas morning, her cousin in Islington laughing at the inside verse, her nieces and nephews tearing the envelopes open with eager fingers. But that winter had not unfolded as it had in years past. The city itself seemed muted under the pall of frost and fog, and within her own house a stillness had settled that rendered the familiar rituals impossible. Her mother, Mrs. Pritchard, had not left her room for 3 days. She had been discovered once in the early hours, reclining in the parlour chair with a blue-labelled bottle at her side. Eleanor had closed the door quickly, forcing her own hands to remain steady, despite the tremor that had threatened to betray her horror. The scent lingered, sharp and sweet, curling into the corners of every room, weaving itself into the wallpaper and carpet, and it made the act of daily life, let alone the task of writing cheerful messages, feel futile. Eleanor dipped the quill into the ink again, drawing a thin line across the top of the first envelope. Her hand hovered, shaking slightly. The words she had rehearsed in her mind for weeks now felt empty, meaningless, against the backdrop of a household undone. She could hear the muffled sound of her mother's breathing upstairs, shallow and irregular, punctuated by a faint sigh. The thought of attempting to lift the veil of chemical haze from her family's world seemed like trying to sweep snow from a storm. Outside, the frost pressed against the windows like a watchful sentinel, and the fog drifted lazily along the narrow streets. Carriages passed quietly, their wheels muffled by the thickening ice, their passengers unaware of the quiet desperation within Eleanor's home. She imagined the couriers who might deliver her cards, unaware of the pall that hung over each doorstep. Each envelope remained a promise unfulfilled, a piece of joy withheld, an act of connection impossible in a world undone by ether. She placed the quill back into its stand and leaned her forehead against her hand. Her fingers brushed a corner of the top envelope, feeling the delicate embossed pattern. Her eyes blurred. She remembered the Christmases of her childhood, the smell of pine, the laughter of cousins, the clatter of cutlery on polished silver, the harmonious voices of carolers ringing through the street. All of it felt impossibly distant, muffled by the weight of frost, fog, and chemical haze. A faint sound drew her attention, a scratching at the door, the soft shuffle of footsteps. Her younger brother, Timothy, stood in the hallway, pale-faced and uncertain, clutching a small bundle of logs for the fire. His eyes met hers, wide with silent understanding. He knew, as she did, that the season had been interrupted, that the cards would not be sent, that the gestures meant to sustain connection and joy had been rendered impossible by the quiet tyranny of the bottle. Eleanor rose slowly and took Timothy's hand. She guided him to the parlour, where the unlit fireplace waited, and the frost had crept along the corners of the carpet. Together, they placed the cards into a small drawer, safe from prying eyes and the temptation to attempt what could no longer be accomplished. The parcels, once symbols of hope and joy, became silent tokens of endurance, reminders of a season held in suspension, a city shrouded in frost, fog, and chemical despair. Outside, the wind pressed against the panes. The fog swirled lazily through the street, carrying faint echoes of unplayed carols, abandoned markets, and muted footsteps. London had lost its music, its gatherings, its ordinary comforts, and in a small house on Kensington Lane, Eleanor Pritchard closed the drawer of unsent cards, the weight of absence pressing against her chest, and whispered a silent promise that, one day, they would be delivered when frost, fog, and ether allowed the city its breath once more. The infirmary at St. Bridget's, though modest in size, had always been a place of strict order. Its whitewashed walls gleamed under the pale winter light that filtered through the high windows, and the scent of disinfectant, faint, clinical, and comforting, usually dominated the air. Nurses moved with quiet precision, tending to fevered patients, dressing wounds, and noting every detail with exacting care. But by late December, the familiar rhythms had been disrupted. The air carried an unfamiliar sweetness, clinging to the fabric of uniforms, to the edges of linens, to the very floorboards, and it pressed upon everyone who entered like a subtle weight. Miss Abigail Fletcher, head nurse, had been on duty since the earliest hours. She moved from bed to bed, checking pulse and temperature, noting the rise and fall of chests beneath thin sheets. But her attention was drawn more urgently to the small bottles lined along the counter in the preparation room, blue-labelled, slender, and dangerously familiar. She had counted them once in the early morning. 14. Now, mid-morning, only 9 remained. By afternoon, she would count 7. By evening, 3. Each missing vial represented a patient, a family, a home, a story interrupted by the sweet, sharp thief that had invaded the city. Miss Fletcher paused beside the first bed, where a young mother lay pale and trembling, her infant beside her. The mother's hands shook uncontrollably, and a small cloth rested on the bedside table. The telltale fragrance hung faintly about it. Fletcher's jaw tightened. "Stay calm, Mrs. Whitby," she murmured. "Help is here." But the words felt hollow. She had visited this mother twice in the past week, watched her descend further into lethargy, each day more reliant on the bottles that promised relief, but delivered only further surrender. Fletcher's own hands itched with the need to intervene more decisively, yet there were limits to what she could do. The law was slow, the chemists too eager, the city itself too distracted by frost and fog to notice the quiet devastation occurring within its walls. At mid-afternoon, she returned to the preparation counter, counting the vials once more. 3 remained. Her eyes, usually sharp, lingered on them as though willing them to last. The remaining bottles were precious, dangerous, and futile all at once. Each one could save a patient from immediate despair or condemn another to a deeper stupor. A nurse's assistant entered quietly, holding a tray of tea. "Miss Fletcher," she said softly. Another family called. Their mother. "She's been unconscious since dawn." Fletcher's lips pressed together. "Bring her here," she said. She moved toward the medicine closet, scanning the empty shelves, the diminishing supply. The assistant's face paled. "We're nearly out," she said. "Yes," Fletcher replied, voice low. "And we've been nearly out for weeks." She straightened, drawing a breath. "We must stretch what we have, and we must do what we can." Even as she spoke, her mind counted silently. The missing vials, the declining patients, the mothers and fathers at home succumbing to the chemical haze, the children left shivering in empty houses. the carols unsung, the streets deserted. By evening, Fletcher sat alone at the counter, a notebook open before her. She recorded the numbers meticulously: who had received treatment, who had refused, who had relapsed, who had remained steady. Each entry was a small act of resistance, a documentation of defiance against the invisible enemy pressing across the city. Outside, fog drifted past the windows, curling against the panes, softening the edges of rooftops and chimneys. The world beyond the infirmary was muffled, muted, uncertain. Inside, Abigail Fletcher counted once more, hands steady though her heart weighed heavy, eyes lingering on the remaining 3 vials. She knew the city depended on vigilance, on care, on small acts performed in silence, and she understood, more sharply than ever, that even in the midst of frost, fog, and ether, her duty was to hold the line, one patient, one vial, one breath at a time. The vestry of St. Hildegard's, usually warm and bustling with preparation for the day's choir, felt unusually cold that morning. Frost clung to the edges of the leaded windows, and the faint light of dawn barely penetrated the mist-laden streets outside. Choir boys who normally greeted each other with shouts and laughter now shuffled in silently, their eyes wide and haunted, their steps careful as though the very floorboards might betray them. Among them, 11-year-old Thomas Avery clutched his music folder as if it were a shield. His small fingers trembled slightly as he opened it, and the pages rustled in a whisper too loud for the quiet that filled the room. He had spent the night awake, thinking about what he had seen, and the confession he had carried with him for hours now pressed like lead against his chest. Mr. Haddon, the choir master, had begun distributing the day's parts. He moved with the usual precision, his hands lifted, guiding invisible currents of sound that had once been effortless in their coordination. But Thomas could not focus. The memory of last evening clawed at him, the faint clink of glass, the smell of sweet chemical floating from his own home, the sight of his mother swaying near the hearth, her eyes unfocused, and lips trembling over the blue-labeled bottle she clutched so desperately. Finally, unable to bear the weight any longer, Thomas stepped forward. His voice was a fragile tremor, but it carried the gravity of a truth long concealed. "Mr. Haddon, I have something to say." The choirmaster paused, eyebrows knitting. "Yes, Thomas." His tone was patient, but even he sensed the tension that filled the vestry like smoke. Thomas swallowed hard. "It's about my mother. She has been taking it. The bottle." His hands fidgeted nervously, fingers entwining the edges of his music folder. "I saw her last night and she couldn't wake properly. She fell asleep sitting up, and the bottle was in her hands. I didn't know what to do." A hush fell over the room. The other boys glanced at one another, unsure whether to look, to whisper, or to pretend they had not heard. Some avoided his eyes entirely, for all of them carried a similar knowledge, though none dared speak it aloud. Mr. Haddon's lips pressed into a thin line. He lowered his hands slowly, allowing the air to still. "Thomas," he said gently, "you have done the right thing in telling me. This is not your burden to bear alone." Thomas nodded, relief and fear mingling in his chest. But the reality remained. Ether had infiltrated homes across the parish. Children had become witnesses, unwilling confidants to the quiet devastation of their families. The choir boys' faces, usually bright with the energy of music, now held shadows too heavy for their years. "The congregation, the families," Thomas whispered. "It's not just my mother. Others, some have been sick. Some fainted in pews last night." Mr. Haddon exhaled deeply, his hands resting on the edge of the lectern. "I feared as much," he murmured. "This city has grown quiet in ways we could not foresee. You are brave to speak." He motioned to the boys to take their seats. "We will sing today, yes, but we will sing for courage. for the children who cannot speak, and for the families who are lost in the haze. We will let the music carry their voices when they cannot speak for themselves." Thomas sat, heart still pounding, as the first notes of a hymn were struck on the organ. The sound filled the vestry, fragile but insistent, weaving through the frost-stiffened air. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, curling into the corners as if listening. Though Thomas's confession had been heavy with sorrow, it had also unburdened him. For a moment, he was not alone in his knowledge, and as the choir began to sing, their voices tentative yet unwavering, he understood something vital. Even amidst fog, frost, and the quiet tyranny of the blue-labelled bottles, courage could find its echo in whispers, in confessions, and in song, in the elegant heart of Mayfair, where polished stone facades caught the winter light and the gas lamps glimmered like sentinels along the streets. Lady Vivienne Carraway's residence had long been the model of refinement. Guests spoke of her drawing rooms with admiration. The velvet curtains, the gilded mirrors, the polished inlaid floors that gleamed under the lamplight. Each December, she opened her doors to a select circle of the city's most distinguished families, hosting soirees that were whispered about for weeks afterward. But that December, the house told a different story. It began subtly. A servant noticed the frost clinging to the inside of the windows despite the roaring fire. The hearth, though banked with coal, radiated less warmth, as if some invisible force had siphoned it away. Lady Vivienne herself was rarely seen outside the drawing-room, and when she appeared, her figure seemed diminished, almost swallowed by the layers of silk and lace she habitually wore. Her movements were slow, measured, uncertain. Her eyes, once bright with command and wit, now flickered with a clouded, distant light. It was the blue-labelled bottle she carried, small and innocuous to a casual observer, that cast the longest shadow. Her reliance on it had begun with discreet indulgence, a few drops to steady her nerves during early evenings of entertaining. But over the weeks, the pattern had deepened into a quiet dependence, and the city's gossip had begun to whisper, faintly, of a mistress of Mayfair, unravelling behind closed doors. One morning, her housekeeper, Mrs. Alden, found her slumped across a chaise, her gloves half removed, the bottle resting lightly in her lap. The woman's breath caught as she approached, careful not to startle Lady Vivienne. "Madam?" she said softly. No reply came. She tried again, brushing a strand of hair from her mistress's forehead. Still nothing. Only the faint, sweet chemical tang lingered in the air, a subtle, relentless reminder of the influence that had crept into the house. When Lady Vivienne stirred, her gaze was distant, unfocused. "The guests," she murmured, her voice barely audible. They cannot know." Mrs. Alden nodded silently. She had learned long ago that argument was futile. Explanation unnecessary. The substance had woven itself so tightly into the fabric of her mistress's life that even the memory of social obligations felt fragile, unsteady, almost foreign. Over the next few days, the decline became more pronounced. Invitations to soirees remained unsent. Letters of reply lingered in envelopes unopened. Menus for Christmas dinners lay untouched, the planned arrangements gathering dust. The servants moved through the house with quiet, deliberate steps, aware that any sudden noise might disturb the fragile equilibrium of a mistress who existed half in reality, half in chemical haze. Neighbours began to notice the change, subtle though it was. Gas lamps reflected in darkened windows where candlelight should have danced. The occasional shadow of a figure crossing the drawing-room moved with a hesitancy that betrayed the mistress within. Rumours passed along the quiet streets that Lady Vivienne had grown thin and pale, that she sometimes forgot to appear at her own windows to wave to passing carriages, that her once commanding voice now trembled. Inside, she sat by the fire, bottle in hand, staring at the frost-encrusted window. The city outside moved with its usual, muted energy servants hurrying, carriages rattling, snow drifting in silent obedience to the wind. But within, a small empire of elegance and authority had begun to crumble, its boundaries defined by the haze of ether and the slow erosion of vigilance. Yet, despite the decline, Lady Vivienne remained a shadow of her former self, a cautionary monument to the quiet dominion of the blue-labelled bottle. Mayfair's frost-bitten streets whispered around her, carrying tales of what was lost behind gilded doors, and the city, in its winter hush, seemed to bend beneath the weight of one mistress's surrender. In the drawing-room, she lifted the bottle once more, her hands trembling slightly, and exhaled softly. Outside, the fog thickened, pressing against the windows, as though eager to carry her secret into every corner of the city she had once commanded with wit, grace, and charm. The little shop on Fleet Lane, with its narrow windows and stoic wooden door, had become a place both feared and depended upon. Inside, the air was thick with the faint chemical tang that had invaded every home in the parish. Shelves that once held a meticulous array of powders, tinctures, and syrups now bore the telltale blue-labelled bottles in troubling abundance and troubling absence. The chemist, Mr. Claiborne, moved among them with deliberate, mechanical motions, counting, replacing, tallying. Each missing vial marked not only a transaction, but a household touched, a family altered, a life suspended in delicate, precarious balance. He had known for weeks that the city's dependence on ether had grown beyond polite indulgence. He had watched mothers and fathers, gentle and respectable, drift through their own homes in a haze, children left to witness the slow erosion of normality. He had noted the abandoned Christmas trees, the unread letters, the dinners left uneaten, the hushed whispers of neighbours, and he had done nothing beyond filling the orders as they came, his conscience muffled beneath the steady rhythm of business, until the morning that it became unavoidable. The first customer arrived earlier than usual. A young mother, pale and shivering, carried her infant, wrapped in a thin, threadbare blanket. She approached the counter with hesitant steps, eyes cast downward, and asked for enough to see the evening through. Mr. Claiborne, counting the remaining bottles, realized with a jolt that he could provide it, but at what cost. "Madam," he said carefully, "I cannot sell this to you." Her eyes lifted in disbelief. "But the chemist down the street, he is no concern of yours," Claiborne said sharply. "I am your chemist. I am responsible for what leaves this shop." The mother's hands shook. "You cannot refuse a lady in need." Claiborne pressed a hand to his forehead, fighting the familiar nausea of dread. He had measured, he had weighed, he had waited, but he could no longer ignore the quiet devastation threading through the city. Mothers collapsing, children wandering, fathers drifting into stupor, carolers absent from the streets. The evidence was everywhere, undeniable. "I have kept count," he said, voice low. "I have tallied each vial, each order, and I can see what is happening. This is no longer medicine. It is a plague, subtle, invisible, and deadly. I will not contribute to it." The woman's lips trembled, but she said nothing. She placed the coins on the counter and backed away, defeated. Her child stirred in the blanket, tiny fingers curling around her shawl. Claiborne watched her leave, the bell above the door ringing faintly as it closed, carrying with it the faint echo of something lost. For the first time in decades, he stood alone behind the counter. His fingers brushed over the remaining bottles, cold glass slick with condensation. The blue labels gleamed like eyes, watching him, daring him to falter. He exhaled, a long, deliberate breath, and began to rearrange them not for display, but for conscience. Later that day, he began a journal, writing each transaction, each refusal, each household he had refused to supply. He documented his observations: the children, pale and wary, the mothers, trembling and quiet, the fathers, lost to haze, the streets, unnaturally silent, the Christmas trees abandoned. By evening, word had begun to circulate. Claiborne, the chemist on Fleet Lane, had refused sales to some of his most trusted customers. Neighbors whispered in frost-covered streets. Some admired his courage, others accused him of arrogance, of judgment, of meddling in lives that were no longer his responsibility. He knew it would not end tonight. The blue-labeled bottles were in every home, in every corner, in every hand. But for the first time, he had taken a stand. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, carrying the faint scent of frost, soot, and faintly, ether. Inside, Claiborne wiped his hands on his apron and stared at the remaining bottles. The city might continue to fall, one household at a time, but he had, at last, spoken his conscience. And in the silence of his little shop, that alone felt like a small victory. The rookeries of Southwark had always been a place of quiet menace. Narrow alleys stacked high with timber-framed dwellings, roofs leaning on one another as if in shared conspiracy. Even in the depths of winter, the streets teemed with life, children darting through frost-laden puddles, vendors calling over the hubbub, the occasional scrap of music or laughter threading through the gloom. But on the night the fire began, the usual rhythm was broken by a strange, subtle quiet, a tension that hung in the fog as heavily as the smoke would soon hang in the air. It started, as so many disasters do, in a single room, a small kitchen, in a corner house where the McAllisters lived, cramped and cold. Mrs. McAllister had risen early that day, her hands shaking slightly as she lit the morning fire. The blue-labelled bottle rested on the windowsill, half filled, half forgotten, a talisman of escape in the icy dawn. She did not see the cloth, damp with ether, that had been placed carelessly near the hearth. Its fibres hung like waiting shadows, smelling faintly sweet beneath the smoke of the coal. By noon, a neighbour noticed a thin curl of smoke escaping through the cracks of the eaves. By evening, it had grown into a steady, hungry wisp, licking at the corners of the low timber beams. The wind carried it into the alleys and stairwells, and soon every house on the block smelled of acrid smoke, sharp and alarming. Constable Harrow, who had patrolled the rookeries for years, arrived swiftly, his boots crunching over frost-covered cobbles, his lantern cast trembling light across the narrow alleys. He saw flames beginning to consume the lower beams of one dwelling and heard the frightened cries of children trapped behind doors. Smoke stung his eyes, and he coughed as he moved closer, realizing at once that the fire would not be contained by any small measures. The residents, many of whom had already suffered under the invisible tyranny of ether, moved with slow panic. Mothers clutched children to their chests, their hands trembling, skirts trailing frost across the floors. Fathers stumbled through the fog, their eyes wide, seeking buckets or blankets or any tool that might slow the inevitable. The chemical haze from previous nights seemed to mingle with the smoke, creating a sickly sweetness that made the air thick and choking. From the upper floors, Mr. McAllister appeared at a window, shouting for help. His wife and children were safe in one room, but the fire spread faster than they could flee. Ladders were brought, neighbors scrambled, and yet, despite their best efforts, the flames devoured the wooden stairs, the rafters, and the walls with merciless speed. By nightfall, the fire had leapt from house to house, feeding on the close-packed timber and the forgotten combustibles. Lanterns flickered in the alleyways, casting long shadows across frightened faces. Children clung to their mothers, fathers barked orders and cursed in despair. The smoke rose into the fog, turning it into a dense, suffocating veil that wrapped the entire block in a silent, terrible embrace. Across the rookeries, the news spread quickly. A fire had begun in one home, but it was not just the fire that terrified. It was the presence of ether in every corner, the forgotten bottles, the cloths damp with chemical sweetness that made each flame more dangerous, more unpredictable, more deadly. By the time the brigade arrived with water and hoses, the houses had begun to collapse. Roofs caved, walls fell. Families were pulled from windows, wrapped in blankets, coughing and shivering, their eyes wide with the raw shock of near loss. The fire burned into the night, leaving a block of blackened ruins, timber smouldering, frost settling over charred bricks, and the smell of chemical smoke lingering long after the flames had died. As dawn broke, the rookery lay in silence. Smoke drifted through the alleys, frost glimmered over the ruins, and the city held its breath. The fire had claimed structures, yes, but it had also revealed the quiet, creeping devastation that ether had wrought fragile homes, distracted families, and the lingering scent of a winter's terror. London had survived the night, but in the rookeries it had been reminded how easily the city and its people could be consumed by flame, by frost, and by the invisible poison that had spread like a ghost through every home. The clock struck 12, though no one in the city seemed to hear it. Gas lamps glimmered dimly through fog so thick that the outlines of buildings wavered like faint, uncertain sketches. Usually, at this hour in December, the streets of London would pulse with life. Carolers clattering along the alleys, families returning from late visits, the occasional cheer of children lingering near market stalls. But on this winter's night, a hush had settled that was heavier than frost, more oppressive than fog. In the narrow streets of Clerkenwell, snow lay thick upon the cobblestones, muffling the soft echo of footsteps. Windows were shuttered, curtains drawn tightly against the cold and the world beyond. A faint glow seeped from the occasional hearth, but even it seemed subdued, its warmth stifled by invisible hands. The city had been warned, cautioned, and constrained. The blue-labelled bottles had emptied hands too easily for too many. Londoners were retreating into their homes, each door closing not with celebration, but with quiet resignation. In a modest parlour on Gray's Inn Lane, the Davenports sat together around a small fire. Children huddled beneath thick blankets, their breaths visible in the cold room, their eyes wide with confusion. Outside, the streets were deserted. There would be no carolers tonight, no markets, no neighbours laughing or calling across the lanes. The city was silent, as if holding its breath, waiting for a judgment too dreadful to name. Mrs. Davenport pressed a hand to her chest. She had been restless all evening, her thoughts clouded, her hands reaching repeatedly for the bottle on the mantel that had become both comfort and curse. Mr. Davenport watched her, his own heart heavy with helplessness. He could not bring himself to take the bottle from her. She would not respond if he tried. He could only sit, hands clasped, and hope that sleep might come without the intervention of ether. Upstairs, in a small house on Bishopsgate, young Henry Thorne lay awake in his bed, staring at the frost-furred window. The candle on his bedside table flickered fitfully, casting shadows across the wall. He had heard whispers earlier from neighbours, from servants, from his own mother about the city's warnings, about limits placed upon festivities, about dangers cloaked in chemical sweetness. He pressed the quilt to his chin, wishing for the usual hum of a Christmas Eve, the clamour, the laughter, the certainty that warmth and cheer still existed. But tonight there was only silence. In St. Hildegard's, the organ remained unplayed. Choir boys who should have been practicing for the midnight service instead pressed their small hands together in hushed prayer. The vestry, usually alive with music and mischief, was empty, save for the faint echo of footsteps that carried no joy. Reverend Ashcombe stood at the pulpit, gazing through the frosted windows. The blue-labelled bottles that had been found in homes, pockets, and even hidden in corners of the church itself seemed to linger in the air, almost sentient in their ability to still hearts and mute voices. Outside, the fog pressed closer to the streets, curling around corners, slipping beneath doorways, seeking every crack and crevice. The snow, previously crisp and bright, lay dull and silent, undisturbed by footfalls or laughter. London itself seemed to have folded inward, retreating from the season it had once celebrated with pride. And yet, within the silence, small acts of resistance flickered like dim embers. A mother tucked her children into their beds, whispering prayers for their safety. A father stoked the fire in the hearth, ensuring warmth for those he could not save from ether's reach. A lone choir boy closed his hymn book and pressed his hands together, vowing to remember the music when it could be heard again. This silent midnight was not peace. It was a city suspended, caught between frost, fog, and the quiet tyranny of a blue-labeled bottle. The lights may have glimmered, the candles flickered, but the warmth and sound of London's usual Christmas had vanished, leaving only the hushed exhalation of a metropolis holding its breath. And so, for this night, the city waited, silent, cold, watching, hoping that the dawn might bring more than frost, more than fog perhaps, just perhaps, a hint of the life and light that had been stolen by the winter and the subtle poison that had taken hold. The frost had hardened into a brittle crust that morning, crunching beneath the boots of city officials as they walked the streets of Clerkenwell and Whitechapel. City Hall had dispatched inspectors to investigate the quiet devastation that had crept through London in recent weeks. Empty pews, abandoned markets, fainting mothers, and children left to wander beneath the watchful fog. The reports from midwives, choir masters, and concerned neighbours had been alarming enough. Now the officials would see for themselves. Detective Inspector Carrington led the small party, a clipboard clutched tightly to his chest, breath-forming clouds in the icy air. Behind him, a clerk carried ledgers filled with complaints, letters, and observations from Dr. Montford, the head chemist, and various parish priests. Each house they passed was a study in unease. Frost on windows thickened, curtains drawn tight, a faint, almost imperceptible scent of sweetness, the chemical hint that marked the infiltration of ether. Their first stop was a modest row house on Bishopsgate, where a young mother had collapsed 2 days prior. The windows were shuttered, but the faint light of a lantern gleamed through cracks in the slats. Carrington knocked firmly, his gloved knuckles sounding a muted alarm against the wood. A maid opened the door slowly, eyes wide with suspicion and fatigue. "Inspector," she whispered, stepping aside. She, her words faltered. Carrington entered, eyes scanning the small parlour. The air was thick with the faint chemical tang. A bottle rested near the hearth, half consumed. A crib sat in the corner, shivering in the draught. The mother lay on a chaise, her skin pale beneath the dim candlelight, her fingers twitching occasionally. Carrington's hand hovered over his notebook. He had seen many things in his career, but the quiet, insidious reach of this substance, the way it had invaded homes and minds, left him unsettled. "Where are the children?" he asked softly. The maid gestured toward a corner. 3 small figures huddled together, shivering, their faces pale, eyes wide. "They stay there," she said. I cannot bring them near her." He nodded grimly. Each house they visited told a similar story. Fathers slumped against walls, mothers unmoving, children quiet beyond their years. The streets were empty of the usual December bustle, as though the entire city were holding its breath, fearful of disturbing the delicate, chemical-induced stupor within. By midday, the inspectors moved on to a larger residence in Mayfair, where a society mistress had become increasingly unwell. The grand house was silent. Ornaments remained untrimmed, the fire burned low, and servants moved cautiously, careful not to upset the fragile household. Carrington noticed bottles on the mantels and side tables, scattered like small sentinels. The sweet, cloying odour hung in every corner, stubborn and pervasive. He made careful notes, addresses, family members, observations of condition, the number of bottles recovered or visible. He wrote with precision, knowing that each record would be vital. It was not just a matter of law or morality. This was a study of a creeping epidemic, invisible yet destructive, touching every level of society, from the mist-shrouded rookeries to the gilded halls of Mayfair. By late afternoon, the frost had begun to thicken underfoot, and the inspectors retreated to their carriage. Each officer was silent, weighed down by the enormity of what they had witnessed. London, it seemed, had surrendered its streets, its churches, and its homes to the subtle, relentless influence of ether. Carrington gazed through the fogged window of the carriage, watching the glimmer of lamplight on the frost-covered pavements. Each shuttered home and silent street was a testament to the city's fragility. The investigation had begun, but the scale of the problem, the number of households touched, the depth of dependency, the subtle corruption of winter's joy, was far beyond what any report could fully convey. And as the carriage rumbled back toward City Hall, the cold pressing through the layers of coats and gloves, Inspector Carrington made a note in his journal. London's frost had revealed more than ice and snow. It had revealed a city suspended, teetering between survival and collapse, held hostage by a blue-labelled bottle and the quiet despair it left in its wake. The churchyard of St. Bartholomew's lay beneath a thin veil of frost, each gravestone capped with delicate ice that glimmered in the weak winter sunlight. It was the kind of morning that might have invited quiet reflection and remembrance, yet the air carried a sharp undertone of unease. Parishioners who had come to tend graves or deliver wreaths moved in hushed steps, eyes darting to the windows of nearby homes, where shutters remained closed and curtains drawn. Even in the solemnity of the cemetery, questions lingered, whispered, unspoken, and urgent about the people who no longer answered to the usual routines of December. Father Ashcombe walked slowly along the frost-crusted path, his coat drawn tightly about him. In his hands he carried a small ledger, filled with notes of deaths that had occurred under circumstances both ordinary and peculiar. Some were documented as sudden collapse, others as prolonged illness, fainting, or disappearance. All, he had learned, carried a shadow of the same insidious presence, the subtle, sweet chemical scent that marked ether's quiet dominion over households. At the edge of the churchyard, a mother knelt by her daughter's grave, brushing the frost from the stone with trembling hands. Her lips moved in a soft, repetitive murmur, though whether prayer or recollection, no one could tell. Behind her, 2 boys lingered near a low hedge, peering through misted breath. They had heard the stories of neighbours who did not wake, of mothers lost to chemical slumber, of fathers stricken with lethargy. The children's questions were too heavy for words. Their eyes, wide and bright, reflected fear and incomprehension. Father Ashcombe paused beside a small plot where a young man had been interred only days before. The death had been sudden, unexplained, yet the midwife's report had noted the unmistakable scent of ether in the chamber. He touched the cool stone, tracing the letters with a gloved finger. Questions swirled in his mind. How many more would succumb? How far had the substance spread? How many families would face grief alone because they could not or would not intervene? A pair of parishioners approached, hesitant, their breath forming clouds that mingled with the mist. "Father," one whispered, "we do not understand. Our neighbour, he simply fell asleep in the chair. Then he did not wake. The children saw everything." Father Ashcombe nodded gravely. "I know," he said softly. He had seen the children's pale faces, their small hands trembling as they tried to care for parents lost to slumber, their innocence pierced by fear too deep for their years. The plague is quiet, but it moves swiftly. You are right to question, to seek understanding. This is no ordinary winter. The parishioners exchanged glances, their unease reflected in the frost-laden graves around them. They had attended funerals before, of course, but the pattern now seemed deliberate, almost methodical, a creeping shadow that passed silently from home to home, leaving grief in its wake. A crow cawed overhead, startling the congregation into silence. The sound echoed over the gravestones, a brief, harsh note that seemed to demand attention. Father Ashcombe lifted his eyes to the sky, tracing the fog as it swirled above the parish. The city beyond lay muted, shuttered, quiet. Children whispered in hallways. Mothers trembled in drawing rooms. Fathers slouched in chairs that should have held their weight in care and vigilance. And everywhere the scent lingered, faint, sweet, unrelenting. He closed his ledger gently, the frost pressing against his gloves. "We must bear witness," he murmured. "Record the losses, guide the living, and remember the fallen. These questions, though painful, are necessary. They are the only way we may yet reclaim our city from the quiet tyranny that surrounds us." As the small congregation dispersed, stepping carefully over frost-hardened ground, the churchyard seemed to exhale. Silence pressed upon it once more, thick and deliberate. Stones glittered coldly in the sunlight. Fog curled around each corner, and in that winter morning, every question left unanswered felt heavier than the weight of snow on the ground, pressing upon the living as insistently as it pressed upon the dead. The courtroom of the district magistrate had never been warmer than it was that December morning, yet the heat did little to dispel the chill pressing upon those gathered within. Windows were fogged with breath and frost, and the faint scent of coal mingled with the sharper, sweeter tang that clung like a shadow in every household. Ether. Even here, in the formal, polished chamber, the chemical's presence seemed to linger, subtle, insidious, reminding all who entered of the lives quietly undone beyond the walls. Mrs. Harriet Bellamy, a widow of few years but considerable fortitude, took her place in the witness box. Her coat was heavy, lined with fur, and her gloves were damp from frost. Yet no outer warmth could shield her from the memory of the past fortnight. Her husband lying insensible for hours at a time, her neighbors' children wandering unattended, the persistent, sweet smell that had permeated her home and the homes around her. The magistrate, a stooped man with spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, nodded to her. "Mrs. Bellamy, you may speak freely." Harriet inhaled, her breath rising in delicate clouds. "Sir, I have come to tell what I have witnessed, what I cannot remain silent about any longer." Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the edge of the box. "It is the ether. It has taken hold of our city." She paused, glancing briefly at the small gallery of spectators. Faces were pale, attentive, curious. A few murmured among themselves, but her voice, firm, urgent, commanded silence. "It began quietly in my household," she continued. "My husband, he would rise in the mornings, yet his eyes were distant. He would speak, but his words slurred and uncertain. He could not tend the fires, could not prepare the children for school. Each day, the blue-labeled bottle he kept near him grew emptier, and he weaker. I thought, perhaps, it was fatigue, or the weather, but I soon discovered it was not." The magistrate's pen scratched across his ledger, noting her words. "I am not alone," Harriet said. Her voice quavered but did not break. "Neighbors have suffered in the same way. Mothers collapsed in the street. Fathers fell in their shops. Children, small children, have been left to wander, frightened and hungry, while the adults drifted in stupor. The midwives have reported cases I cannot bear to repeat in full detail. Houses once lively are now silent. The air itself, it clings like a ghost. The streets, once filled with carolers and cheer, are empty. Our Christmas, sir, it is stolen from us." Her eyes glistened as she spoke, yet she pressed on. "I come to you not only to recount the suffering in my own home, but to implore that action be taken, that limits be imposed, that the substance be controlled, that families be protected. I have lost my husband's attention, his strength, and his guidance. I see my neighbors losing theirs as well. How many more must be affected before the city acts?" A hush fell over the chamber. The magistrate lowered his pen and adjusted his spectacles. Outside, the wind pressed against the frosted windows, carrying the faint smell of smoke and coal, mingled subtly with the lingering sweetness that had infiltrated the city's homes. It was as though the very walls held their breath, listening. He spoke quietly but with authority. "Mrs. Bellamy, your testimony will be recorded. Your words are clear and grave. The city will take heed." Harriet exhaled, a small measure of relief mingled with lingering dread. She had spoken the truth that others dared not voice. She had borne witness to the quiet devastation. As she stepped down from the box, frost clinging to her gloves, she understood the weight of her act. Testimony alone could not undo the damage, nor could it restore the Christmases lost to households drowned in haze. But it was a beginning, a small, flickering spark of vigilance against the slow, insidious decay that had claimed London. Outside, the fog swirled and pressed against the windows. The city listened, and, for a fleeting moment, it seemed to pause, as though weighing her words against the winter's chill and the chemical shadows that stretched over every street and home. By mid-December, the streets of London whispered of change. The frost, thick and unyielding, clung to every rooftop and railing, yet it was not the cold alone that pressed upon the city. The invisible hand of authority had begun to reach into homes, parishes, and chemists' shops alike. Blue-labelled bottles, once traded with casual discretion, now sat under scrutiny, their presence both feared and tightly monitored. In a small meeting room of City Hall, the Board of Health convened to draft the new regulations. The chamber, with its high ceilings and tall sash windows frosted along the edges, was filled with the muffled hum of concern. Reports from midwives, parish priests, and concerned citizens lay stacked upon the table, each detailing the slow, insidious destruction wrought by ether. The air carried a faint sweetness residue of the chemical's reach into homes, clinging to clothing, drifting through the fog outside, infiltrating even the deliberations of those sworn to protect the city. Dr. Montford, the physician who had first spoken openly, sat at the head of the table, fingers pressed against the ledger before him. "The scope of dependency is greater than anticipated," he said, voice low but firm. "Mothers collapse, children wander unattended, houses are left cold and empty. If we do not act decisively, the city itself risks decay." Councillor Whitfield, an older man with a distinguished air, adjusted his spectacles. "Decisive action, yes, but we must balance caution with commerce. Chemists provide a necessary service, and indiscriminate restrictions may provoke unrest." Montford's eyes narrowed. Necessary service? If the product is killing and disabling, then its trade is no longer a service. It has become a hazard. Each blue-labelled vial in circulation carries risk to body, to mind, to the very social fabric of this city. A clerk scrawled notes rapidly, ink smudging slightly under his haste. The chamber grew silent, each member of the board absorbing the weight of the physician's words. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, a pale and persistent witness. Somewhere beyond, chimneys exhaled smoke, carrying the faint scent of the chemical into streets already muted by fear and frost. Councillor Langford, a woman of precise speech and unflinching logic, leaned forward. "We will impose restrictions on the sale of ether. Licensed chemists only. Records must be kept meticulously. Quantities limited per household. Deliveries monitored. No transactions without clear documentation of need, verified by a licensed physician." A murmur passed through the room. Some nodded. Others frowned at the implications. Montford continued, "Furthermore, we must enforce accountability. Any chemist found distributing beyond these limits, or supplying those not verified by medical authority, will face suspension or worse, revocation of license. This is not merely precaution, it is protection." Councillor Whitfield pursed his lips. And enforcement? Our constables are already stretched. The fog and frost hamper vigilance. How can we ensure compliance without overburdening them? Langford's eyes met his sharply. By documentation, by rigorous oversight, by making the rules unequivocal. The city has already suffered too much. This is not a matter of convenience. Montford leaned back, exhaling slowly. It is no longer a question of law alone. It is a question of life. The midwives have reported nearly a dozen collapses this week alone. Choir boys faint in rehearsals. Mothers sleep through meals. The children witness it all. If the city's winter is to survive, we must act now. The council agreed to draft the regulations immediately. Licenses would be issued only to chemists who submitted to inspection. Sales would be logged meticulously. Excess stock would be confiscated. Notices would be posted, letters dispatched, and public awareness campaigns launched. Outside, the fog pressed thicker against the city. Streets remained hushed. Windows were shuttered. Children listened from hidden corners. Mothers watched from behind curtains. Fathers lingered near doorways. And somewhere, high above the frosted roofs, the blue-labeled bottles sat in shop shelves, waiting yet already. Their power was constrained by the authority of law, by the vigilance of those who had finally decided to act. The city, frostbound and muted, had taken its first careful steps toward reclaiming the Christmas it had nearly lost. By the third week of December, Dr. Alistair Montford had retreated to his study, a small room above his apothecary that overlooked the frost-laden roofs of Clerkenwell. The city outside lay shrouded in a pall of fog and ice, streets deserted, shutters drawn, and the faint, sweet scent of ether drifting from homes where vigilance had already failed. It was here, amidst ledgers, inkpots, and the scattered remains of herbs long dried, that Montford prepared his report for City Hall, a document that would detail, in careful, forensic prose, the extent of the crisis gripping London. He had spent the past fortnight moving from house to house, visiting families who had fallen under the chemical's quiet dominion. Mothers, pale and trembling, had been found slumped beside their cradles. Fathers, hollow-eyed and listless, could not attend to the hearth or the children. And in many homes, blue-labeled bottles rested in plain sight, their contents deceptively small, yet powerful enough to undo every act of care and devotion. Choirs faltered in the churches. Markets remained silent. Streets, once vibrant with December cheer, were now muffled, subdued, and unnaturally quiet. Montford dipped his quill into the ink and began to write, his strokes deliberate and measured. He opened with a summary of the households visited: the Abernethys, where the father had collapsed mid-breakfast; the Whitmans, whose children wandered unattended through frost-crusted corridors; the Harringtons, whose annual banquet had been abandoned at its first toast; and the Davenport residence, where the mistress had spent hours in chemical haze, oblivious to the warmth of her home. Each entry was catalogued with time, location, and the precise observations of physical and mental decline. He paused to sip from a small cup of tea, inhaling its warmth and noting how even the comfort of a simple drink was faint against the lingering sweetness that had saturated the city. The blue-labeled bottles were everywhere, their influence extending from Mayfair to Whitechapel, from quiet terraces to grand houses, leaving no district untouched. He included in the report accounts from midwives, parish priests, and choirmasters, each testimony bearing witness to the subtle, insidious reach of ether into domestic life. Montford's hand trembled slightly as he added details from the infirmary: the young mother who had collapsed 3 times in a single week, the children too pale and listless to play, and the elderly man whose final hours were spent in quiet chemical stupor. He recorded each dosage, each instance of dependence, each pattern of decline. Numbers alone, he knew, could not capture the quiet horror, but they would form the framework for intervention. He concluded the report with recommendations: strict licensing for chemists, meticulous record-keeping, restrictions on household quantities, oversight by medical authorities, and public notices warning families of the dangers. He underscored the urgency, noting that the winter season with its cold, its darkness, and the approach of Christmas amplified the risks. The document closed with a stark sentence: if immediate action is not taken, the social and moral fabric of London will be further compromised, and more lives will be quietly consumed by this substance. Montfort leaned back, resting his head against the wooden chair. Outside, fog swirled in silent currents along the rooftops. Gas lamps glimmered like distant, watchful eyes. Even in the warmth of his study, the chill of frost and fear seeped through the panes. He knew the report would alarm some, comfort few, and anger many. Yet he also knew it was necessary. For London was a city suspended in chemical haze, its families fractured, its children uncertain, its streets unnaturally quiet. And the doctor's winter report was the first clear call, a beacon cutting through the fog, a plea for recognition, and a warning that the season, the city, and its people could not survive unheeded. By the final week of December, a tentative order had begun to return to some of London's frost-laden streets, though the air remained thick with the faint, lingering sweetness of ether. The city's lamplighters moved along their usual rounds, casting trembling light across cobbles dusted with frost, yet the glow seemed less celebratory and more like a fragile promise. In certain households, where vigilance had been maintained and the blue-labelled bottles were removed or closely controlled, a quiet restoration began, slow, deliberate, and often painful, as though the process of reclaiming normality required every ounce of will and care. In a modest home on Gray's Inn Lane, the Whitmans were among the first to experience it. George Whitman had spent the past fortnight steadfast at the side of his wife, guiding her through the haze and helping her resist the temptation of the bottle. The children, once silent and anxious, now moved cautiously about the room, their voices tentative but clear. The hearth glowed warmly, its light reflecting upon ornaments that had been hastily hung and dusted after weeks of neglect. A small tree stood in the corner, carefully trimmed with paper chains and ribbon, modest yet full of intent. Mrs. Whitman, still pale but alert, arranged a few final decorations. Her hands trembled occasionally, remnants of the chemical influence that had gripped her so completely. Yet she smiled faintly as she placed a tiny glass bell on a low branch, a signal of regained attention to the rhythms of the household. George watched her, noting the fragile beauty of her movements, the careful way she touched each ornament as if it were a precious token of reclaimed life. Outside, the frost sparkled in the weak winter sun, and the faint sounds of cautious activity began to emerge. Footsteps crunched along the cobbles, a vendor called softly from a nearby stall, and a child's laughter, muted but unmistakable, drifted from a neighbouring home. The city, though still subdued, was beginning to breathe again. In another home, the Davenports were repairing the routines that had been lost. A simple dinner was prepared with care, the table set modestly but deliberately, silver polished, and napkins folded. The children helped, under close guidance, their excitement tempered but genuine. No bottles lurked upon the mantel. Each movement, each gesture was deliberate, conscious. The family had reclaimed its attention, its warmth, its vigilance. The parish also noted small signs of recovery. Choir boys, though still cautious, returned to practice in staggered groups. The organist, careful and deliberate, lifted his fingers to the keys once more, coaxing notes that had lain dormant for weeks. Even the midwives, weary but steadfast, observed that fewer collapses and disturbances occurred in households now practicing restraint. The city's subtle pulse returned, uneven yet discernible, a tentative rhythm restored by human care and the careful removal of chemical interference. Yet the restoration was not complete. Blue-labeled bottles remained in pockets and drawers across the city, some hidden, some forgotten. Fog still pressed against windows, and frost crept beneath doors as if to remind all that vigilance was required. Families rebuilt slowly, conscious that the threat of relapse lingered in the shadows, a quiet predator waiting for neglect or fatigue to weaken their defenses. George Whitman paused by the window, watching his children play near the hearth and his wife move with measured confidence. The warmth, though fragile, was real. He exhaled, a small sigh that mingled with the winter air. The home, once fractured, was slowly being put right. Outside, London remained cautious, streets glimmering with frost and fog, but within this household, the city's quiet resilience had found a foothold. And so, in that small corner of Clerkenwell, winter carried both the weight of frost and the fragile promise of renewal. Life, though tempered by loss and vigilance, had begun its slow reclamation. The home, slowly put right again, stood as a testament to patience, courage, and the quiet, unyielding determination of those who refused to surrender entirely to the blue-labeled poison that had nearly stolen the season. The first rays of a pale winter sun broke through the lingering fog, touching the frost-laden streets with a hesitant shimmer. Inside the drawing-room of the Davenport residence, a single candle flickered against the chill, casting long shadows that trembled across walls once heavy with neglect. The house, though still quiet, bore the faint stirrings of renewal. Furniture had been dusted, the hearth banked with fresh coals, and the blue-labeled bottles that had once dominated every surface were now confined to a single, locked cupboard. It was a fragile order, carefully maintained, but it was enough. Young Clara Davenport clutched her small hymn book with trembling fingers, her breath rising in visible puffs as she glanced toward the doorway. The family had agreed softly, carefully to attempt something once thought impossible, to sing a carol. It had been weeks since their voices had lifted together in music, weeks in which silence and the fog of chemical dependence had muted the household. Now, under the cautious eye of her father and mother, Clara opened the book. "Shall we?" her mother whispered, voice still faint, distant, but lucid. Clara nodded. Her brother, William, and younger sister, Margaret, followed suit, their small hands clutching the pages with nervous anticipation. George Davenport took a deep breath, steadying himself, and placed his fingers lightly on the edge of the piano. The first tentative notes rose, fragile and uneven, like the first stirrings of life in a house long subdued. Clara began the melody softly, her voice uncertain, wavering between pitch and hesitation. William joined on the second line, his voice stronger, though still tentative. Margaret, encouraged by her siblings, added her own high notes, thin and quivering. George kept time with gentle keystrokes, his eyes glancing at his wife to gauge her presence, her attention, her willingness to participate. For a moment, it seemed as though the house itself were listening, leaning closer, holding its breath. The fire crackled faintly in the hearth, as if in approval, and the frost pressed against the windows like a pale audience, still and reverent. Outside, the fog clung to the edges of rooftops, swallowing the muted sounds of the city. But within the walls of the Davenport home, music began to take root again. The carol was halting, breathless at times, but it carried a weight far beyond melody. It was a statement of resilience, a declaration that the household would not yield entirely to the insidious reach of ether. Each note was a small act of defiance, a reclaiming of the rhythms and warmth that had once defined the season. Clara's voice strengthened, William's grew bolder, and Margaret's trilled uncertainly but persistently. Even Mrs. Davenport, sitting near the window with her hands folded, hummed softly, her lips moving in a subtle echo of what had once been effortless. When the final notes drifted into silence, the room seemed to exhale. The candlelight flickered once more, and the frost outside sparkled faintly, catching the weak sunlight. The family sat in quiet, letting the sound linger in their minds, savoring the fragile victory. "It is only the beginning," George whispered, more to himself than to the others. "But it is a beginning." Clara smiled, tentative, her heart lightened by the act of creation, however small. Margaret leaned against her sister, comforted by the presence of sound, rhythm, and voice. The house, though still shadowed by the remnants of neglect, felt warmer, more present, more alive. Outside, the streets of London remained quiet, the fog heavy and the frost unbroken. Yet, in a single home on Gray's Inn Lane, voices rose in cautious harmony for the first time in weeks. The first carol sung in years had returned not with grandeur or ceremony, but with careful, deliberate love, a quiet triumph against the winter, the fog, and the lingering, sweet threat that had so long silenced the city. And for a moment the household understood what it had almost lost, and what, with patience and courage, it might reclaim. The lamplighters moved through the fogged streets of London with their customary solemnity, though this Christmas Eve their steps carried a weight far heavier than the usual responsibility of igniting gaslights. Frost clung stubbornly to rooftops and railings, and the thick, persistent fog swallowed the city in muted grey. The glow of lanterns along the streets had never seemed so tenuous, so fragile, as if the slightest tremor of wind might snuff out the tiny flames that held the darkness at bay. Thomas Larkin, one of the oldest lamplighters on Bishopsgate, adjusted the weight of the ladder upon his shoulder and exhaled through the frost-laden air. His breath rose in pale clouds, mingling with the faint, sweet tang that still clung invisibly to the city's homes, a residual perfume of ether, subtle but unrelenting. The streets were unusually still, save for the occasional clatter of a carriage or the distant cry of a solitary child, and Thomas found himself scanning the windows of houses along his route, noting with unease the shuttered curtains and empty hearths. At number 32, he paused. The window above the parlour was dark, though in previous years it would have glowed warmly with candlelight, reflecting the laughter of children and the careful arrangements of festive decorations. A faint scent reached him even in the street, the sweet, insidious aroma he had come to recognize too well. Ether, he frowned, checking his ladder and setting it carefully against the building. He climbed with deliberate, silent care, mindful that the season's joy had been diminished here, perhaps irreversibly. He lit the first lantern, its flame wavering against the chill. It illuminated the frost upon the window pane, revealing the outlines of chairs and tables left untouched for days. A single stocking, unfilled, hung limply by the mantel. Thomas adjusted the flame, coaxing it into steadiness, and stepped back to admire its small warmth. Even this modest act felt monumental in the heavy, silent city. Moving down the street, he encountered the rest of the route, each lamppost a sentinel in the fog, each flame a fragile defiance against the pervasive quiet. The city had been subdued by weeks of chemical influence, of households hollowed by dependence, of children frightened into stillness. The carolers were absent, the markets remained shuttered, and yet, with every lantern he lit, Thomas felt a small, stubborn pulse of resistance, a reminder that light could persist even when the streets themselves seemed muted. At the corner of Bishopsgate and Threadneedle, he paused again. The air carried the faint echo of music, a tentative carol sung from within a single household, fragile, uncertain, but unmistakable. He stopped to listen, feeling a rare warmth amidst the cold. A family inside must have dared to reclaim a fragment of tradition, their voices threading through the fog like a small, defiant chord against the pervasive silence. Thomas exhaled, shivering slightly, and continued. He moved from street to street, lantern by lantern, each flame steadying the darkness in a city that had forgotten its seasonal joy. In homes where frost pressed against window panes, where ether's influence lingered in the air, and where children and adults alike had been subdued into unnatural quiet, the lamplighter's flames offered a small, resolute reminder that the world outside was still awake, still vigilant. By the time he returned to the depot, the route complete, the streets had been transformed in subtle but meaningful ways. The fog remained thick. Frost still glittered. Ether's ghost lingered in quiet corners. But the lamplighters had delivered their charge, each light a symbol, each flame a tiny beacon of continuity, endurance, and hope. On this Christmas Eve, London remained subdued, cautious, and fragile. Yet for the first time in weeks, the city could see itself reflected in 1,000 small flames, each steady against the darkness, each asserting that even amidst frost, fog, and chemical haze, there remained light to guide the way. The frost had begun to thaw slowly beneath the pale winter sun, though the streets remained slick with ice and the mist lingered stubbornly in alleyways. For weeks, London had existed under a muted vigilance, blue-labelled bottles removed or confined, homes slowly restored, streets quiet, and Christmas curtailed. The ban on gatherings had hung over the city like a shadow, pressing against shutters, muffling voices, and silencing carols. But on this particular morning, a notice arrived that carried an almost tangible warmth, slipping beneath doors and pressed into the hands of citizens. The ban was lifted. In a modest drawing room on Gray's Inn Lane, the Whitmans read the notice aloud, their voices unsteady with a mix of disbelief and hope. George Whitman's hands trembled slightly as he held the paper, the ink smudged by the moisture of his breath. Edith Whitman, still pale from weeks of near-constant chemical vigilance, reached for his hand and squeezed it, her eyes wide and glistening. The children, small, cautious, and pale, crowded around the hearth, clutching one another. Can we celebrate now?" young Margaret whispered, her small face pressed against the parchment. George smiled faintly, though the weight of the past weeks pressed against his chest. "We can try," he said, slowly, carefully. "But yes, we may reclaim our season." The news travelled swiftly through the city, carried by whispers, frost-stiffened footsteps, and the cautious excitement of those who had held their breath for too long. Choirmasters reopened vestries, cautiously calling their choristers back. The organ at St. Hildegard's was warmed, keys polished, and bellows tested. Streets once silent with fear began to echo softly with children's voices, tentative and trembling at first, then stronger as confidence returned. In Mayfair, Lady Vivienne Caraway allowed herself a cautious smile as she began to tidy her drawing rooms. Curtains were opened, ornaments dusted, and the long-neglected invitations to friends were at last penned. Though her movements were careful, deliberate, and still shadowed by weeks of chemical reliance, there was a spark in her eyes that had long been absent, the possibility of regained control, of seasonal joy reclaimed from the grip of ether. Even the lamplighters, who had carried their small flames through fog and frost with steadfast determination, noticed the change. Lanterns gleamed more brightly as dusk approached, their light reflecting against frosted windows where families, once hesitant, now gathered to prepare for modest celebrations. The streets remained cautious, but there was movement, a pulse returning to the city's winter veins. In the poorer districts, midwives and parish priests guided families back into routine. Houses were scrubbed and warmed, meals were prepared with care. Children, once huddled silently in corners, were coaxed into play, their voices tentative but gradually growing stronger. Even amidst lingering traces of ether, households began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, but unmistakably alive. George Whitman guided his family to the hearth, where small candles flickered alongside the fire. The children arranged their ornaments on a modest tree, placing each one deliberately, with attention and care. Edith Whitman, her hands steady for the first time in weeks, helped. The warm glow of the fire reflected in their eyes, a quiet triumph against the weeks of stillness, fear, and chemical haze. Outside, London remained muted, fog lingering and frost glittering under the winter sun. Yet the city had begun to reclaim its rhythm. The ban lifted, voices would rise again, carols would be sung, markets would slowly fill with cautious activity, and the streets, long silenced, would carry the soft hum of life. For the first time in many weeks, London exhaled, quietly, collectively, and with fragile hope. A shadow had receded, and though vigilance would remain necessary, the city understood, at last, that the season could be reclaimed. Christmas, diminished but not extinguished, had returned to the hands of those who had fought to preserve it. The city held its breath as the final days of December unfolded, a fragile hush interwoven with frost, and the last lingering wisps of fog. London had endured weeks of restraint, of muted streets and shuttered windows, of families subdued by the quiet tyranny of blue-labeled bottles. But with the lifting of the ban, a subtle shift began, almost imperceptible at first, the soft stirring of life attempting to reclaim its rightful place. In the narrow streets of Clerkenwell, children's laughter, tentative and cautious, threaded through the air. Their steps crunched over frost-hardened cobbles, lighter than weeks before, carrying the echo of the rhythm of normalcy long forgotten. Windows, shuttered for weeks, were opened gradually, revealing families brushing dust from ornaments, arranging modest evergreens, and tending to hearths that had been neglected in the quiet desolation. The scent of pine mingled with the faint smoke of fires, a reminder that warmth and light could return even after weeks of chemical pall. In the Whitman household on Gray's Inn Lane, the restored order was almost ceremonial. George Whitman oversaw the placement of the final ornaments on a small tree, each child's hand guided with careful encouragement. Edith Whitman, her eyes brighter and movements steadier than they had been in weeks, draped garlands with a measured grace, a quiet triumph over the haze that had held her captive. The children, wide-eyed and cautious, sang softly, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence, their voices threading through the room like fragile, golden light. The churches, too, began to reclaim their role. St. Hildegard's, once quiet and empty, now held small gatherings. Choir boys practiced under the watchful eye of the choirmaster, their notes fragile but insistent. Parishioners, hesitant but determined, filled the pews in staggered numbers, breathing carefully to preserve the fragile equilibrium of alertness and health. The organ's pipes, warmed for the first time in weeks, filled the nave with sound, steady and comforting, echoing off the stone and mingling with the faint daylight streaming through frost-frosted windows. Even in Mayfair, Lady Vivienne Caraway allowed herself a cautious optimism. Her drawing rooms, once neglected and silent, now bore modest decorations and the faint hum of conversation. Invitations were penned and sent, though in smaller numbers than in previous years, and dinners were prepared with deliberate care, mindful of both propriety and the lingering fragility of health and attention among her guests. The household moved with deliberate care, yet beneath each movement was a quiet exhilaration, the possibility of reclaiming what had been nearly lost. Outside, lamplighters moved along fogged streets, their lanterns casting small circles of warmth across frost-laden stones. They noticed children playing at safe distances, couples walking with cautious joy, and the subtle flicker of candlelight in windows where families were once silent. London itself seemed to exhale, the frost softening, the fog thinning, and a quiet sense of possibility threading through the city's veins. The memories of the weeks past lingered, of collapsed parents, wandering children, abandoned carols, and shuttered streets. Those shadows had not vanished, and the scent of ether, though diminished, reminded all that vigilance remained necessary. Yet within homes and streets, families had begun to reclaim their lives, small gestures of care, cautious song, modest decorations, each an assertion against the quiet tyranny that had so recently held sway. And so, for this Christmas, London remembered both its fragility and its resilience. The city had endured frost, fog, and the subtle poison that had nearly stolen its season, yet it had reclaimed warmth, song, and human connection. The streets, the hearths, and the voices of children and parents alike bore witness to a city that had survived not untouched, but alive. This was the Christmas London would never forget, a season tempered by caution, shadowed by past sorrow, yet illuminated by the steadfast determination of those who refused to surrender to despair. Frosted rooftops and fog-laden alleys might hide shadows still, but in every candle-lit window and every cautious carol sung, London reclaimed, at last, the quiet triumph of hope and remembrance.